sometimes history hits you with stories so vivid, so intense, they just grab you by the collar. Think of charging tribesmen against Maxim guns or legionnaires described as demons in battle. These are the kinds of images waiting for us in the sources for today's deep dive.
That's right. We're diving into a stack of material provided by a listener, specifically excerpts from a book called Empire Eternal by Sinclair Jenkins. It's a collection of essays, and it offers a very particular look at historical conflicts and figures.
And that particular look is absolutely key to our mission today. This book presents a really clear perspective that the age of imperialism and colonialism represents the apex of Euro-American civilization. The author argues for a return to a European and American-led world order, explicitly framing history as a war of all against all for space, and including a call for Euro-Americans to conquer and stand alone.
So our goal in this deep dive is, as always, not really to debate or endorse these viewpoints, but to impartially unpack the historical events and arguments as they are presented within this source material. We want to understand what details the author chooses to highlight and why the source believes they are significant, following the structure laid out by the book's chapter titles.
Okay, so prepare for a journey through history seen through this very specific lens. We'll touch on conflicts from early America and the Barbary Wars, explore Victorian Africa, the Boxer Rebellion, the French Foreign Legion, border conflicts during the Mexican Revolution, Italian imperialism, struggles in post-colonial Africa, and finally, the author's analysis of the present state of what the source refers to as Western civilization.
Yeah, it's quite a range. And the source provides some pretty striking examples and arguments for each period.
All right, let's jump right in with the source's foundational premise. The very first section is titled War of All Against All.
Right. The author opens by introducing this concept, presenting it as their view of the fundamental nature of historical struggle. It's a framework where competition, particularly for territory or space, as the source puts it, is seen as the main driving force.
And flowing directly from that, the source discusses what it terms the bunker mentality.
Yes, this idea that European minorities in various historical contexts develop a specific kind of defensive mindset. The source cites examples like Colonel Reginald Dyer in British India. His upbringing as a white minority, influenced by tales of the Sepoy Mutiny, is presented as, shaping his actions.
Yeah, and the Sepoy Mutiny brings us to a specific, quite grim historical event mentioned by the source.
The Bibigar Massacre of 1857. The source describes how survivors from Kanpur, mainly women and children, were, brutally slaughtered by local butchers under Nana Sahib. And this is presented as a key trauma contributing to this bunker mentality.
And this isn't just limited to British India, right? According to the source.
No, not at all. The author applies the same idea to the Pinois of French Algeria and explicitly states that white South Africans today share this mentality, rooting it in their experiences as minority groups.
What's particularly striking, I think, is how the source draws a parallel way back to colonial New England.
Yeah, it argues the Puritans, clinging precariously to the Atlantic coastline, sort of shared a similar disposition. They faced enemies on multiple fronts, the French in Canada, various Native American tribes, and this is all set against the backdrop of King Philip's War.
A conflict described as emerging after that first generation of leaders passed away.
Right. The source notes the earlier peace established by Massasoit with Plymouth Colony back in 1620. But the deaths of Massasoit and the original New England leaders, that changed the dynamics, and this was exacerbated by the English desire for more land.
The source even contrasts the initial intentions of the New England settlers with how things actually unfolded.
It does. It argues they weren't primarily warriors, but more religiously minded merchants who initially hoped for a peaceful, biracial Protestant society. They were deliberately trying to avoid what the source calls the evils of Spanish colonialism, killing Indians, importing African slaves.
But this idealism, it didn't last.
No. The source points to events like the Jamestown Massacre of 1622 as an early shock. And it explicitly states that King Philip's War ended this idealism in New England, becoming what the source itself calls a war of ethnic cleansing.
The source highlights some contrasting military approaches within the colonial forces, too.
It points to the general ineptitude of the New England Confederation, but then contrasts figures like Major Richard Waldron, who was apparently quite brutal and saw pitched battles, with Benjamin Church. Church was a carpenter, a land speculator who believed in maneuverability, using Indian allies and actually training his men to fight like the Indians.
So how does the source conclude this section on King Philip's War and connect it to the present?
Well, the source notes Metacom's defeat and then offers a very direct message to the reader. It suggests that when you're confronted by someone arguing their ancestors built this country, you should reference King Philip's War and state, no, we fought for it and died for it, and it will always be our civilization. That's presented as the author's explicit takeaway.
Okay. The source then shifts focus pretty dramatically to American expansionism in a section titled The American Conquistador.
Right, and this section is framed by Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
The source describes this as a core American belief from 1845, before America became a nation of self-hating post-nationalists, tracing the term back to John L. Sullivan.
And the key figure highlighted here is William Walker.
Yeah, presented as America's very own conquistador.
Huh.
The source places him in the context of Americans supporting these filibustering attempts, like Narciso Lopez's in Cuba, driven by the desire for annexation, potentially as a slave state.
Walker himself seems driven by this thirst for adventure.
Definitely. The source notes his dreams of military adventure, despite, lacking formal training before his 30s. This led to his first attempt, the Sonora Expedition in 1853.
Can you describe that expedition based on the source?
Sure. He left San Francisco with about 100 men, claiming it was for mining, but they were secretly armed. The source depicts northern Mexico as desolate, troubled by Apache raids, with a corrupt Mexican government that preferred other European settlers over American land-hungry Yankees. Walker justified his action as a civilizing mission to protect Mexicans from Apaches. He apparently took La Paz pretty easily, declaring the Republic of Sonora.
But the reality was, well, less glamorous.
Much less. The source states the expedition lacked planning. His men were untrained volunteers prone to looting, and they faced skirmishes with local Mexican forces. Interestingly, the source argues his most significant enemy was actually the U.S. Pierce administration itself.
The Republic of Sonora failed, but Walker wasn't deterred.
Not at all. The source notes the failure in Sonora didn't stop him. His next target was Nicaragua, a region coveted by American industrialists like Cornelius Vanderbilt for its potential canal route along the San Juan River.
And he got involved in Nicaragua's internal politics, right?
Yes, in 1855, the source notes the liberals hired Walker's force, his phalanx of immortals, in their conflict with the conservatives. Walker took control and became president of Nicaragua in 1856.
His presidency included some controversial decisions.
Most notably, restoring slavery. The source attributes this to a mix of wanting to attract Southern immigrants and a belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority. His ultimate ambition, the source states, was to build an English-speaking empire right there in Central America.
This ambition created quite a bit of opposition.
It did. Central American nations allied against him. The source describes this conflict as becoming a war of extermination, claiming Costa Rican soldiers executed innocent American and European civilians.
And Vanderbilt played a key role in his downfall.
Yeah, apparently incensed by Walker seizing his company's property, Vanderbilt hired Sylvanus Spencer, described as a New York ruffian, to retake control of the transit routes. This effectively destroyed Walker's naval capacity.
Which left Walker's forces stranded.
Exactly. The source describes the grueling land war, including the siege of Grenada, where his men were decimated by fighting, disease, and desertion. This led to his surrender to the U.S. Navy in 1857.
Yet he still wasn't finished with adventure.
No. The source notes he returned to New Orleans, still proclaiming himself president of Nicaragua, and continued lecturing, still apparently desiring military action. This led to his final campaign in Honduras,
where he was finally captured and executed.
Convinced by British ships to land at Trujillo, he took a fort but then faced bombardment threats. He surrendered to a British commander. But the source states the British used subterfuge and handed him over to the Hondurans. Charged with unlawfully declaring war, William Walker was executed by firing squad in 1860.
So how does the source summarize Walker's legacy?
Well, those who met him, the source notes, recognized his dream of an English-speaking empire in Central America. His views on slavery were tied to his belief in Anglo-Saxon superiority. The source also notes his influence on Confederate veterans who became mercenaries, connecting it to the author's own ancestor. Walker is consistently presented as America's very own conquistador.
And the source's concluding thought on his legacy, it's quite speculative.
Yeah, it references a 2018 petition by some Bay Islanders to rejoin the British Commonwealth and speculates maybe Walker's dream isn't dead but waiting for a figurehead with the courage and gall to carve out a private kingdom.
Okay, let's take a moment here for our first micro recap. We've covered the source's core idea of the war of all against all and the bunker mentality. We saw how it applies this to figures like Colonel Dyer, events like the Bibikar Massacre, and groups like the Pied-Noirs and white South Africans. Then, we looked at the source's interpretation of King Philip's war-initial Puritan idealism, giving way to what the source calls ethnic cleansing, highlighting figures like Waldron and Church, and that direct message about fighting for our civilization.
Exactly. And just now, we delved into the American conquistador section focusing on William Walker. We covered his Sonora expedition, his Nicaraguan venture, including becoming president and restoring slavery, the opposition he faced from Central American nations and Vanderbilt, his eventual capture, execution, and the source's framing of his legacy and lingering dream.
Right, about 5 minutes covered there.
Yeah.
Now, the source shifts again, looking at early American conflicts with Muslim states. This section is titled The American Empire versus Islamism.
And the section starts by challenging the whole idea of American isolationism, arguing it never really existed. It points to the long history of the U.S. Navy conducting small-scale expeditions for commerce and civilization.
And suggests a saner past foreign policy existed.
One focused on protecting the Western Hemisphere, keeping shipping lanes open, and prioritizing the Navy over the Army. The source suggests this type of foreign policy could easily return.
The primary example used here is the Barbary Wars.
Right. The source describes the context: Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers, Morocco, and their corsairs or pirates. It highlights President Jefferson's understanding, or interpretation, that these pirates were motivated more by Islam than by wealth.
And it includes a really specific quote from Tripoli's ambassador.
Yeah, this is presented as a key point for the source. In 1785, the ambassador apparently explained their justification for taking ships was written in the Quran. He stated that nations not acknowledging Muslim authority were sinners, that Muslims had the right and duty to wage war on them, enslave prisoners, and that dying in battle guaranteed paradise. The source presents this as the core motivation.
The source mentions Commodore Edward Preble's squadron and the loss of the frigate Philadelphia,
which led to Lieutenant Stephen Decatur Jr.'s famous mission in 1804. He volunteered to destroy the captured Philadelphia. The source describes his daring raid into Tripoli's harbor, with men disguised as Maltese and Arab pirates, boarding the ship, freeing hostages, and killing about 20 pirates without losing a single man, framing it as a significant success.
And the impact of this raid?
Well, the source states that while the war dragged on, Decatur's raid effectively took the starch out of the Muslim corsairs. And the source critiques historians who see this only as a commerce conflict, arguing they ignore the religious motivation highlighted by that ambassador's quote.
Beyond the Barbary Wars, the source mentions expeditions to Sumatra.
Yes, as other early examples of conflict with Muslim groups. The first Sumatran expedition in 1832, a punitive action ordered by President Jackson after an American merchant vessel was attacked. The USS Potomac bombarded a town, Marines were deployed, resulting in Sumatran casualties. A second expedition happened in 1838-39 after another attack.
How does the source frame these Sumatran conflicts?
It notes some view them as early skirmishes in the War on Terror, but the source's specific view is that they were the U.S.'s first sustained contact with Islamic fighters.
Okay, the source then connects this thread to the Philippine-American War and the Moro Rebellion.
Right. After defeating Spain in the Philippines, which the source calls costly, the U.S. faced a second front on the Muslim-majority island of Mindanao against Moro rebels. The source notes the Spanish called them Moros because they resembled their old Moorish enemies from Spain.
The source provides some characteristics of the Moros,
stating they practiced polygamy and used infidel slaves. It highlights American military fears that the Moros would treat U.S. troops as they had the Spanish FIMs, capturing lone soldiers, torturing them, emasculating them, even burning them alive. The source quotes these specific fears.
And their tactics included suicide attacks.
Yes. The source emphasizes the use of amoks, described as berserker-like Muslim warriors. And the source argues that these people proved unwilling to be civilized by Presidents McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt.
General Leonard Wood faced significant challenges there.
The source notes he faced multiple tribal rebellions, leading over 100 expeditions just to Jolo and beyond. The Battle of Budayo is highlighted, where his forces climbed 2,000 feet to take on 600 Moros in an extinct volcano crater. While the source notes the American press called it too savage, the source simply states Wood won the day.
And the rebellion continued for quite some time.
Yeah, until 1913, when the source states 6,000 to 10,000 Moro warriors made a last stand at Budbagsac.
What is the source's final conclusion on the Moro rebellion?
It says it stayed nothing more than a rebellion. but stood as yet another example of Islam's power within the Pax Americana, tying it back into the section's overall theme.
Okay, that's another section covered. Let's pause for micro recap number 2. We started with Manifest Destiny and the source's take on it, then dove deep into William Walker, the American conquistador. We covered his Sonora and Nicaraguan adventures, his brief presidency, restoring slavery, the opposition from Central America and Vanderbilt, his capture, execution, and the source's view of his legacy.
Right, and following that, we moved into the American Empire versus Islamism. We discussed the source challenging American isolationism, focusing on the Barbary Wars, the Tripoli ambassador's quote about religious motivation, Decatur's raid, and the critique of purely economic interpretations. Then the Sumatran expeditions as early sustained contact, leading into the Philippine-American War and the Moro Rebellion. We touched on Moro characteristics, tactics like the Amoks, General Wood's campaigns, including Budejo, and the source's conclusion framing it as another example of Islam's power within the American sphere.
Good summary. That's about 10 minutes of content there. The source then shifts focus to a significant conflict in Africa during the Victorian era. This section is titled Islamic State in the Victorian Era.
Right, and the section opens, interestingly, with Rudyard Kipling's poem Fuzzy Wuzzy. The source uses this to introduce the Bayha tribesmen of Sudan, quoting lines that praise their fighting ability even while calling them heathen.
These were the Bayha tribesmen fighting the Anglo-Egyptian army.
Yes, between roughly 1883 and 1899. The source describes their fierce independence and their fighting style, riding hard and fast directly into British steel armed only with spears and small swords, apparently scorning firearms.
And their motivation was tied to a specific religious figure.
Exactly. They pledged loyalty to Muhammad Ahmed, who was proclaimed the Mahdi, the savior of Islam, by a wandering holy man around 1880 or 1881. The source references Michael Asher's book On Khartoum, noting that Beja's claimed descent from Noah's son Ham and connection to pre-dynastic stock, while also mentioning modern genetics raise questions about that lineage. They're presented as an ancient people with a tradition of rugged liberty.
What were the modest movement's goals, according to the source?
Primarily to purify Islam and drive out the Turks and other infidels. They viewed the Turco-Egyptian bureaucrats, even though they were Sunni Muslims, as venal, corrupt, and essentially apostates not truly practicing their faith. The presence of non-Muslims in the Ottoman civil service was also seen very negatively.
And Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but with its own Khedive, felt compelled to act.
Yes, despite Sudan not being a vital economic engine or crucial for border security, Khedive Tewfik felt obligated to maintain control, as his ancestor Muhammad Ali had conquered Sudan in 1822. So in 1883, Tewfik sent an expeditionary force under Colonel William Hicks into Sudan to put down the insurgency. The army was mostly conscripted Egyptian peasants, the fellahin, known to even mutilate themselves to avoid service.
And the result was disastrous.
Utterly. Muhammad Ahmed's 40,000 dervishes ambushed Hicks's force at El Obeid in November 1883. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers just dropped their weapons and fled, or begged for their lives hoping their shared Muslim faith would spare them. Many were stripped naked and sold as slaves in modest markets. As for the white officers, Hicks apparently fought bravely with his sword, impressing the Beja, but he and others like Seckendorf were mutilated after their deaths.
News of this slaughter reached Britain,
triggering panic in Cairo. British leaders were conflicted. Sir Evelyn Baring wanted withdrawal. But the source suggests figures like Sir Alfred Milner saw modest power as indicative of the Liberal Prime Minister Gladstone's weak rule. Public and Queen Victoria's pressure in 1884 led Gladstone to send a military envoy to observe and report.
And the man chosen was Major General Charles Chinese Gordon.
Right. Gordon's persona is described as intellectual, devout Christian, mystic, a wonderful field commander, his nickname from his role in the Taiping Rebellion. Though the source notes some saw him as erratic or overrated. Crucially, he got himself appointed Governor General of Sudan, something Gladstone had explicitly forbidden.
Gordon, despite his reputation, faced a huge challenge in Khartoum.
Yes, he and his garrison of about 7,000 troops were soon besieged by over 50,000 dervishes. His reports back to Cairo and London were often ignored or received too late.
British relief efforts failed to reach him in time.
Despite some military actions like the Suakin expedition under General Gerald Graham and the Battle of Tamai in 1884, where the Black Watch's bayonet charge is mentioned, though their square was breached. The source notes that the average British soldier proved better than the Fuzzy Wuzzy at frontal charges with cold steel in 1884-1885. Still, the main Nile expedition failed its objective. Khartoum fell on January 26, 1885. Thousands of modest troops stormed the city.
And Gordon's fate.
He was speared to death and his head was cut off. The source notes Queen Victoria blamed the slow-moving Gladstone.
The source provides some really disturbing details about the fate of other Europeans in Khartoum after the takeover.
It does. It recounts the gruesome fates of consuls and civilians. Nikolaos Leontes, the Greek consul, had his hands severed before being beheaded. An entire Greek family was killed, the pregnant wife taken as a concubine. Martin Hansel, the Austro-Hungarian consul, was betrayed by a former servant and decapitated. Franz Klein, a tailor of Hungarian Jewish heritage who had converted to Catholicism, had his throat slit while his Italian wife and 5 children were forced to watch, and his daughter was raped. The Catholic mission was raided and left, quote, drenched in blood. The source presents these as specific atrocities.
How does the source characterize modest Sudan itself beyond the violence of the conquest?
It explicitly calls it a theocratic state controlled by religious fanatics that prefigured the Islamic State by more than 100 years. The source argues modest policy actively encouraged rape and the ethnic cleansing of tribes who remain loyal to the Anglo-Egyptian government. This is framed as the source's interpretation.
The modest state was eventually defeated, though.
Yes. Britain waited until 1896 for what the source calls revenge. The Battle of Omdurman in 1898 was decisive. A combined British, Egyptian, and Sudanese army of over 25,000 utterly decimated a dervish force of 52,000. The technological advantage was key. British forces utilized Maxim machine guns and the latest artillery and rifles, suffering fewer than 50 dead themselves. Modest losses were catastrophic. Over 11,000 killed and 16,000 wounded. Kitchener had avenged Gordon.
Okay, let's pause for micro recap number 3. We just covered the section, The American Empire versus Islamism. We talked about the Barbary Wars, the ambassador's quote on Islamic motivation, Decatur's raid, the critique of purely economic views, then the Sumatran expeditions, and the Philippine-American War focusing on the Moro rebellion, their tactics, the Amaks, General Wood, Bud Dejo, and the source framing it as an example of Islam's power relative to America.
Exactly. And just now, we explored Islamic State in the Victorian era. We discussed Kipling's Fuzzy Wuzzy, the Beja tribesmen fighting for the Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmed. We covered the disastrous Hicks expedition, the siege of Khartoum and General Gordon's death, the horrifying details of European fates there. And crucially, the source's explicit argument that modest Sudan prefigured the Islamic State, its policies of rape and cleansing, and finally the decisive British victory at Omdurman due to technology like the Maxim gun.
Right, that brings us about 15 minutes in. The source now turns to a different conflict, one framed very much as a tragedy. This section is titled A South African Tragedy.
Yeah, the source immediately sets the tone, calling the Boer War, 1899-1902, a tragedy and white-on-white crime. It pits 60,000 Boer commandos against the might of the British Empire.
The Boers initially had some success, didn't they?
They did, pushing into Natal, giving what the source calls a bloody nose to the British officer corps. The source states the Boers, through their fighting, earned the right to rule their own republics, the Transvaal and Orange Free State, in peace terms. But, it adds, British imperialists saw things differently.
The source attributes the war's origins, citing historian Martin Bossenbroek, to the discovery of gold in the Transvaal about a decade earlier.
Right, leading to the rise of Johannesburg as a boomtown. It touches briefly on the political maneuvering involving figures like Willem Leeds, a Dutch lawyer hired by the South African Republic, and economic transactions involving Boers, French, Germans, and Portuguese Mozambique, though the source dismisses this section as boring. It highlights the big personalities, particularly Cecil Rhodes, the mining magnate who took mercenaries across the border.
Leading to the infamous Jameson raid.
Yes, the failed 1895 attempt by Rhodes and Leander Starr Jameson. The source states, this raid proved Britain was serious about putting its own people first regarding the resources in the Transvaal.
Okay, here's where the source draws some really explicit modern parallels.
Yes, the author states quite bluntly, for us in the 21st century, the parallels are clear. It compares the situation to the present-day U.S., arguing that the government of Mexico profits from exporting cheap labor while simultaneously agitating for anti-white, pro-Hispanic causes within the U.S. The source claims Mexico City doesn't hide these motivations, and groups like La Raza view illegal immigration as a great war strategy for the Reconquista, quoting that specific phrase.
This leads to the source's core parallel assertion. Demographics is destiny.
Stating this applies equally in Victorian South Africa and present-day America.
The source also discusses the clash of propaganda surrounding the Boers.
It says the Boers countered British propaganda by exposing London and its Christian missionaries as being infatuated with the myth of the noble savage. British do-gooders, according to the source, chastised the Boers for failing in their civilizing mission and accused them of racial hostility.
And the Boers' perspective, according to the source, how did they see it?
They were under no such illusions. Having fought vengeful tribes all their lives, they believed they knew how to make peace, unlike the, quote, redneck British.
The source then connects this historical situation directly to the apartheid era.
It argues that this cultural ignorance was repeated during apartheid when, according to the source, left-wing British governments and their allies harassed, boycotted, and harangued the Boers into giving black South Africans the vote. The source concludes, quite starkly, that since then, South Africa has failed.
And it quotes Gemini again on the Congo Rebellion.
Yes, using Gemini's description of the 1964 Congo Rebellion as a fanatic movement against the white man and appealed to wild dreams of a colored dominion of the world. The source explicitly links this back to its view of the motivations behind opposition to the Boers and the subsequent situation in South Africa.
So what is the source's final conclusion on the Boer War itself?
Well, despite the horror, the source sees Bossenbroek's book as depicting an age of true manliness, filled with audacity, courage, adventurers, and Renaissance men. It calls it a shame that the British Empire fought the tiny Boer republics.
And the explicit lesson drawn from the war, according to the source,
That European brotherhood and the continuation of Western civilization is far more important than any temporary conflicts or disagreements. That's presented as the key takeaway.
All right, this seems like a good point for our first end-of-chapter mega recap. We've covered quite a bit since the start. We began with the source's war of all against all premise and the bunker mentality applied to various historical European minorities. We unpacked the source's view of King Philip's war as idealism turned ethnic cleansing, mentioning the contrasting figures of Waldron and Church and the source's modern message about fighting for our civilization.
Then we moved to the American conquistador, William Walker, his filibustering in Sonora and Nicaragua, his presidency, the restoration of slavery, the opposition he faced, his execution, and his legacy as framed by the source.
Followed by the American Empire versus Islamism, challenging isolationism, focusing on the Barbary Wars, that key ambassador quote, Decatur's raid, the Sumatran expeditions, and the Moro rebellion in the Philippines, presented as examples of Islam's power relative to the U.S.
And then Islamic State in the Victorian era. The Mahdi, the Bisha tribesmen, the Hicks disaster, Gordon's martyrdom at Khartoum, the atrocities described there, the source comparing Mahdi Sudan to ISIS, and the final British victory at Omdurman.
Finally, just now, a South African tragedy, framing the Boer War as white-on-white crime, its origins in gold, the Jameson raid, the source's explicit modern parallels to U.S.-Mexico, demographics is destiny, Reconquista, the propaganda clash, the link to apartheid's end and South Africa's subsequent failure according to the source, and the concluding lesson on European brotherhood.
Okay, so for your flashcard takeaways for this whole first block. Boer War, source calls it white-on-white crime, 1899, 1902, Boers versus British, a Ho Jameson raid. Failed 1895 raid showed British interest in Transvaal gold, per the source. Where sources parallel? Victorian South Africa and modern U.S.-Mexico summed up as demographics is destiny and mentions the idea of Reconquista, Boer propaganda counter. Source says Boers exposed the British noble savage myth. Apartheid link. Source blames left-wing pressure for voting rights, arguing it led to South Africa's failure. Source's lesson. European brotherhood is more important than temporary conflicts.
And maybe a provocative question based only on the source's modern parallels. According to the source, is the concept of demographics as destiny just a historical footnote, or does the author present it as a pressing modern reality?
That definitely captures the source's linkage.
Okay, moving into the next block of material. The source shifts focus now to East Asia in the early 20th century. This section is titled The Chinese Uprising Against Whites.
Right, and this section is framed by the concept of the Yellow Peril, which the source describes as a recurring theme in Western culture from the late 19th century through World War II, basically, a fear of East Asian aggression or migration.
The primary historical event discussed here is the Boxer Rebellion in 1900.
The source quotes the Boxer slogan, "Kill the foreigners and the Mandarin beasts." It describes the group, the Boxers United in Righteousness, as an anti-Western, anti-Christian, and anti-modernization movement, crucially supported by the Dowager Empress Cixi of the Qing dynasty.
And this culminated in the siege of the Peking Legation Quarter.
Yes, a 55-day siege trapping about 400 foreigners, around 3,000 Chinese Christians, and just a handful of guards inside the diplomatic quarter.
The international response was a coalition force.
Yeah, a pretty loose coalition of European, Japanese, and American troops scrambled to save their citizens besieged in Peking, and the coalition ultimately proved successful in lifting the siege.
What is the source's broader interpretation of the rebellion's significance?
The source argues that the Boxer Rebellion, which it specifically characterizes as an anti-white nationalist movement, actually primed East Asia for a much larger global confrontation later on. Furthermore, the source makes the claim that communist Chinese leaders have invoked the Boxers, both at home and abroad, to play into what the source calls their genocidal designs. That's a very strong interpretation presented here. The source also makes a brief, almost tangential mention here of Colonel Littleton Waller of the U.S. Marine Corps. It suggests he used his experience from the Mahdist Rebellion in Egypt to justify harsh treatment of natives during the Philippine-American War, implying a connection, in the source's narrative, between these different anti-colonial or anti-Western uprisings.
Right. The source had noted the Mahdist Rebellion ended after Omdurman in 1898.
And returning to the Boxers, the source explicitly views them as representing the savagery of the East that, in its view, needed conquest by Christian civilization, making armed confrontation seem inevitable from that perspective.
The timeline involved the rebellion surrounding Peking by May 1900.
Yes, trapping the foreign citizens and also Chinese Christians, who the Boxers were actively killing, along with burning churches. An 8-nation international relief expedition then fought its way towards Peking, finally entering the city on August 14th. The source specifically mentions the U.S. 14th Infantry Regiment fighting against Qing Dynasty defenders and also the Kansu Braves, described as Chinese Muslim fighters sent by the Empress Dowager.
U.S. forces reached the Forbidden City Gate, but didn't capture the Empress Dowager Tichikis.
Correct. The source notes the official reason given was simply to avoid capturing the Empress Dowager, despite her clear support for the Boxers. But the source contrasts this with what it calls realpolitik reasons, suggesting the decision was actually made to avoid the collapse of the Qing dynasty, potential civil war, and the partition of China among foreign powers.
What were the consequences described in the aftermath of the rebellion?
Well, the expeditionary forces looted Peking quite extensively. Russia took the opportunity to occupy Manchuria and seize the strategic Port Arthur, which in turn angered Tokyo.
Leading directly to the Russo-Japanese War.
Exactly, in 1904-05. The source argues this war not only helped cause the 1905 proto-Bolshevik revolution in Russia, but perhaps more significantly, showed millions of Asians that white soldiers were not invincible. The source also claims, controversially, that the victorious Japanese later dehumanized Allied POWs and white civilians during WWII.
The source sees this as the start of a larger trend in Asia.
Yes, the author argues that the Japanese march against European power in Asia really began with their actions in Manchuria in 1931 and then coastal China in 1937.
The Boxer Rebellion also left a deep mark on China itself, according to the source.
It states it opened a historical wound on the Chinese psyche, citing the humiliation of foreign soldiers occupying the Forbidden City being taught to Chinese students. And again, the source claims the Chinese Communist Party used the Boxer example specifically to encourage the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution, a period during which the source notes millions may have been killed.
Okay, let's pause for micro-recap number 4. We just covered the Mahdist War in Sudan in detail. The rise of the Mahdi, the Hicks expedition disaster, Gordon's fall at Khartoum, the gruesome fate of Europeans there, and the source's argument that Mahdist Sudan prefigured ISIS, ending with the Battle of Omdurman. Then we looked at the Boer War, framed as a white-on-white tragedy, the gold rush origins, the Jameson raid, the source's parallels to modern U.S.-Mexico demographics, the propaganda clash, the link to apartheid, and the lesson on European brotherhood.
And just now, we discussed the Chinese uprising against whites, the Yellow Peril theme, the Boxer Rebellion's anti-foreign Christian nature, the siege of the legations, the international response, and crucially, the source's interpretation that this primed East Asia for conflict, the comparison to Waller in the Philippines, the aftermath including the Russo-Japanese War, and the source's claim about the CCP later using the Boxer example during the Cultural Revolution.
Good. We're about 20 minutes in now. The source moves on to look at the French Foreign Legion in the next section, titled White Hats, White Fighters.
Yeah, the Legion is introduced almost cinematically, a fighting force made for Hollywood, known for its iconic white hats, the kepi blanc, and its reputation for enlisting men with nowhere else to go, presented as the stuff of romance.
The source relies heavily on Jean-Vincent Blanchard's book At the Edge of the World, focusing on what it calls the Legion's Golden Age, roughly 1880 to 1939.
Right. And Blanchard's view, as presented by the source, is that the legionnaires weren't entirely rogues, nor were they a fully modern military force in the conventional sense. They were seen as professional soldiers who often fled troubled lives, seeking money, pleasure, and danger. Often, it was an escape from bourgeois culture, aiming to create a Männerbund, a competitive, hierarchical, all-male group.
Key figures are mentioned in this context.
General Hubert Lyautey is central in Blanchard's study, described as having noble ancestry, a military academy background, believing strongly in the civilizing mission, admiring the Arab man, and known for his oil-slick method of slow, hearts and minds colonization, particularly in Morocco. Ernst Jünger, the famous German writer, is highlighted as a youthful recruit who joined to break from the stifling boredom and conformity of a wealthy, peaceful Europe. The source quotes Junger's passage about danger slipping into the distance.
But this romantic idealism often didn't survive the reality of Legion life.
No, the source states quite plainly that idealism was often the first casualty.
Can you describe the daily realities, the hardships and perks according to the source?
Well, the hardships included grueling marches in the hot sun with little food or water, which apparently caused many to give up or become apathetic unless there was a battle looming. But there were perks: showers, French bread, meat stews, and liberal portions of Algerian wine. The source notes the Legion essentially ran on wine and strong coffee, ordered with the phrase au jus. And there were chores, like peeling potatoes and cleaning barracks. The source notes a pride in neatness and order that contrasted with the daredevil image.
The source specifically addresses the reputation about the Legion recruiting criminals.
It does. It states that while the Legion did attract some men running from the law, the idea that it routinely accepted wanted murderers and gave them new identities was mostly German propaganda before World War I. It distinguishes the Legion from the Bataf, which were actual penal regiments of the French army, composed of criminals. The source notes the Legion might accept some petty criminals or those in trouble with other armies, but rarely did they ever provide a new identity to a wanted murderer, rapist, etc.
Nationality is also noted as being predominantly non-French.
Yes, approximately two-thirds were Germans or Austrians. The source gives specific numbers from an 1897 survey. French citizens, men from Alsace-Lorraine, disputed territory, and then Germans formed the largest bloc. Interestingly, France kept its German legionnaires busy in the colonies during WWI rather than deploying them in Europe against Germany.
The Legion was primarily prized for its fighting skills, though.
Definitely. Known for superior fighting ability, traveling light, maneuverability, and a reputation for fighting to the bitter end. The Siege of Cameroon in Mexico in 1863 is held up as the prime example.
Describe Cameroon as the source presents it.
Captain Jean Donjou and just 63 legionnaires were surrounded by a much larger Mexican force, but fought with incredible ferocity in Hacienda until only a handful were left. The source notes the Mexicans themselves call them demons. It's enshrined in Legion legend.
Blanchard's book details other campaigns as well,
including France's long conquest of Morocco, which lasted from 1912 to 1931, though the source notes Lyautey wasn't leading near the end. Also campaigns in Tonkin and Vietnam, and the Rif War in Morocco, where the source mentions Blanchard details the horrors.
Now, what is the source's own interpretation of the Legion's core identity? It differs from Blanchard's, right?
Yes, significantly. The source notes that these multi-ethnic legionnaires came to identify more with the Legion itself than their national origins, and it asks rhetorically if they were united by race. It then makes the rather blunt statement that it didn't take much to inspire legionnaires to fight Arabs, or, using the derogatory terms the source includes, Bosch enemies, Chinks.
And this is where the source explicitly critiques Blanchard.
Right. The source states that Blanchard misses the Legion's core identity as a white fighting force for Christendom. It argues that the legionnaires fundamentally believed they were defending Christian civilization against Islam and heathenism, and that this shared belief in identity was crucial, something Blanchard overlooks.
Okay, the next section dives into a specific and often overlooked conflict along the U.S.-Mexico border. This is titled The Plan of San Diego.
Yes, the source sets the scene in the South Texas borderlands, specifically the Nueces Strip, after the Mexican-American War. It describes the area as retaining its essentially Mexican character. You had Tejano cattle barons using an old-world patronage system, Anglo-machine politicians relying on Hispanic votes, intermarriage between well-to-do Anglo and Tejano families, Anglo settlers converting to Roman Catholicism, and the Tejano elite proud of their Spanish heritage. Johnson is cited describing a cultural and material egalitarianism marking Texas society then.
But the demographics changed significantly with the arrival of the railroads.
They did. Thousands of English-speaking immigrants arrived, farmers, laborers, boomtown types. The source states these new arrivals were often blind to differences among the ethnic Mexican population and saw Spanish speakers simply as cheap labor, quoting directly, nothing else.
And this caused tension.
Yes, economic and cultural displacement led to bad blood. But the source argues that economics alone cannot explain the antipathy towards Spanish speakers, suggesting other factors, presumably racial or cultural from the source's perspective, were at play.
The chaos of the ongoing Mexican Revolution provided the immediate context.
Right. Starting around 1910, the source mentions the key figures Porfirio Diaz, Madero, Huerta, Villa, Zapata, Obregón, Carranza, and the complex shifting alliances. Victoriano Huerta's installation as president in 1913 via a deal involving the U.S. ambassador and his subsequent execution of Madero kept the revolution going. By 1915, the uneasy alliance between Villa, Zapata, Obregón, and Carranza broke into open warfare. Crucially, the source notes that Mexican border raids into the U.S. became a policy during this period.
Leading directly to the document known as the Plan of San Diego.
Yes, signed January 6, 1915, in the tiny village of San Diego, Texas. The source is very explicit about its contents. It called for a race war against Anglos.
What were the specific goals of the plan, according to the source?
To create an independent republic carved out of U.S. border states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California, and then either annex it to Mexico or destroy those states and annex the territory regardless. It called for the killing of all Anglo men over the age of 16. It promised land to freed Black Americans who joined the cause. And it called for killing white women if they assisted Anglos.
The source makes a very strong assertion about Mexican government involvement in this plan.
It does. Citing historians Charles H. Harris III and Louis R. Sadler, the source claims there is conclusive proof that the plan was actually an instrument of Mexican government policy. It asserts the plan was authorized by Venustiano Carranza's government, distributed by Mexican secret agents like Juan K. Forsac, and even partially financed by the Royal Brewing Company, which the source notes was owned by Carranza's Minister of War and Navy, General Candido Aguilar. It quotes these specific details.
The source calls the plan the match that finally lit the powder keg on the border.
Leading to the Sedicioncitas raids starting in the summer of 1915 in the lower Rio Grande Valley. These rebels, or bandits, from both Mexico and Texas, launched around 30 raids against ranches, railroads, and telegraph lines, involving thefts, kidnappings, and the murder of nearly 24 U.S. citizens.
Specific horrific incidents are mentioned to illustrate the violence.
Yes. The source recounts one incident where a U.S. soldier was kidnapped, tortured, decapitated, and his head was displayed on a pole overlooking the border. It also details an event on January 10, 1916, where Villa's men captured a train near Chihuahua City, let the Mexican passengers off, and then murdered 17 of the 18 Americans on board. It quotes this specific number.
These events finally forced a significant U.S. response.
Yes, the horror stories forced President Woodrow Wilson to mobilize half the entire U.S. Army to the border by November 1915. The Department of Justice urged the arrest of Luis de la Rosa and Inesito Pisana, Tejanos active in the anti-Anglo uprising and involved in the plan. Further urgency came after the border raid on March 9, 1916, when Villa's men attacked Columbus, New Mexico.
Describe the fighting at Columbus, based on the source.
American casualties were 10 civilians and 8 soldiers killed. The source mentions Army cooks fighting back with shotguns, boiling water, and axes, and a lieutenant using Bennett Mercy machine guns effectively. The death toll among the Villistas was estimated at around 80. The Columbus raid enraged the American public, demanding Wilson punish Villa. This led to General John J. Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico, although it ultimately failed to capture Villa. The source notes the Plan of San Diego continued until World War I ended, as Carranza ended his support when he allied with Germany and WWI distracted the U.S. The source argues Carranza saw the plan as leverage against the U.S.
The source also mentions the often brutal counterviolence by the Texas Rangers.
Yes, referred to as the Texas Troubles. This involved extrajudicial killings of Tejano families. The source states that official rangers killed over 5,000 Mexicans and Tejanos, sometimes entire families. It also cites historian James Sandos's estimate that over 10,000 Mexicans and Tejanos were killed by rangers and vigilantes combined during this period.
Okay, now what is the modern relevance drawn from this historical event? According to the source, it makes quite a few connections.
It does. The source presents this history as the context for modern calls for securing the border, deportations, which it calls a must, and repatriations. It argues the U.S. military would be better served securing the U.S. border than being deployed in the Middle East or Africa, among populations the source claims seem incapable of saying thank you, quoting that phrase.
The source also argues for investigating Mexican meddling in contemporary American politics.
Yes, it controversially argues that Mexico, along with Qatar, Israel, and China, are the biggest corruptors of the American body politic, more so than Russia or Ukraine. It quotes this specific list.
And on a deeper, more profound level, the source calls for rejecting political correctness and what it calls anti-white ideas in both countries.
Right. Arguing Mexico has been in a constant war with itself and its identity since independence, with populists and left-wingers promoting anti-white and anti-American ideas since the end of the revolution in 1920. The source quotes the current Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, saying the U.S. border wall is a symbol of white supremacy.
How does the source interpret statements like that?
The source sees this action as part and parcel of the wider desire among left-wing Latin Americans to strike at the Yankee Colossus by supporting mestizo supremacy as a replacement for European heritage. This is framed as the source's specific analysis.
The source then makes an assertion about the founding of both nations.
Yes, it asserts that the U.S. and Mexico were established by European Christians as lands for themselves and their progeny.
And argues that liberalism, false egalitarianism, and racial grievance-mongering have obscured this historical fact. So what is the source's proposed solution to stop the plan of San Diego, or something like it, from becoming reality today?
The source explicitly concludes that both the U.S. and Mexico need to regain the racial consciousness of their founders. That's presented as the solution.
Okay, let's take our fifth micro-recap break. We covered the Chinese uprising against whites, focusing on the Boxer Rebellion, its anti-foreign nature, the siege, the international response, the source linking it to later Asian conflicts, and the CCP's use of its example.
Then we move to white hats, white fighters, exploring the French Foreign Legion. We discussed their romanticized image versus reality, Blanchard's book, figures like Liaude and Junger, daily life, recruitment myths, the German-Austrian majority, the Battle of Cameroon, and the source's critique of Blanchard, arguing the Legion's core identity was as a white fighting force for Christendom.
And just now, we detailed the plan of San Diego, the borderlands context, the changing demographics, the plan's call for race war and annexation, the source's assertion of Mexican government involvement in financing.
Right. Plus the Sedition Cetus raids, their horrific incidents cited, the U.S. response, including the Columbus raid and Pershing's expedition, the counter-violence of the Texas Troubles, and finally, the source's extensive modern parallels and arguments regarding border security, Mexican influence, mestizo supremacy, and the explicit call for regaining racial consciousness.
Okay, we're about 30 minutes in. The source takes us back across the Atlantic, looking at post-WWI Muslim-Western conflict. This section is titled, A Little-Known Chapter in the Muslim War Against the West.
Yeah, the section opens by stating that after World War I, Arab fighters, taking inspiration from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, briefly united to fight against the British and French empires in places like British Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, between 1919-20, involving Shia and Sunni tribesmen in raids and sieges, and also in French Mandatory Syria in the 1920s, citing the Franco-Syrian War of 1920, where the French overthrew the Arab Kingdom of Syria.
French troops in Syria included various nationalities, as we heard earlier.
Yes, Arab levies, Senegalese troops, and the French Foreign Legion. After taking Damascus, they face a new, determined enemy, the secretive Druze mountaineers.
The source here relies heavily on John Harvey's book with the French Foreign Legion in Syria.
Right. Harvey was a Welsh former British soldier who joined the Legion. His book recounts the ferocious fighting between the FFL and the Druze. The source acknowledges that Harvey criticized the French command and even the FFL itself sometimes, but notes Harvey reserved most of his venom for the Senegalese troops serving alongside them.
How did Harvey describe the Senegalese troops, according to the source?
Pretty harshly. As less than useless, often in hopeless panic, needing whipping by their white officers to maintain discipline. It quotes these specific phrases. Their only real thirst for fighting, in Harvey's account presented by the source, was for the torture of prisoners. The source quotes this observation directly. Now, the source adds a contextual note here, stating that the French commonly used black soldiers in their colonies and that French soldiers generally knew the African better. It argues that Arab levies fought well for the French, but the Senegalese were an exception. It also mentions the French used Moroccan goumiers effectively, and the Spanish also used native troops, specifically Moroccans.
This transitions the focus to the Spanish colonial situation, particularly their failure in Morocco after losing most of their empire in 1898.
Exactly. With Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines gone, the source argues that the only option left for Spain to maintain some imperial prestige was to conquer and expand its holdings in northern Morocco.
The source highlights Spain's long and often violent relationship with Morocco.
Going all the way back to the early 8th century Islamic invasion of Visigothic Spain by a combined Berber and Arab army originating from Morocco. It mentions the Berber raid in 710 and the fact that the Muslim army left Jewish populations in charge of captured cities like Cordoba and Toledo. The Reconquista, led by Catholic Visigoths holding out in Asturias, is framed as the centuries-long pushback. The fall of Granada in 1492, the last Muslim state on the peninsula, is noted, with the remaining Muslim population given the option of conversion or death. The source reminds us the Almoravids and Almohads who ruled parts of Spain were Moroccan dynasties.
And Spanish and Portuguese Christians brought the fight to Morocco even before the Reconquista was complete.
Yes, conquering the port cities of Ceuta by Portugal in 1415, ceded to Spain in 1668, and Melilla by Spain in 1497. These autonomous cities represented Spanish authority on the Moroccan coast until 1860. A short war against Morocco in 1860 resulted in the Sultan recognizing Ceuta and Melilla as Spanish cities. Conflicts continued, particularly with the Rif Berbers near Melilla, especially after Spain defeated a Moroccan army in 1893-94 and demanded the Sultan police the tribes.
The Second Melillan War in 1909 saw the Rif Berbers actually defeat the Spanish army,
leading to demands for reform back in Spain. Eventually, General Miguel Marina's troops routed the Berbers.
And then the key figure of Abd el-Krim emerged.
Yes, in the mid-1910s, Abd el-Krim rose as the leader of the Rif Berbers, managing to unite the often hostile Rifian tribes against both the Spanish and later the French.
This leads into the disaster of Annual in 1921 for the Spanish.
A major defeat. Abd el-Krim crushed the Spanish forces. The source blames the Spanish general, Manuel Fernández Silvestre, describing him as arrogant and ignoring warnings. Spanish forces were overextended, their fortifications often far from water sources, relief columns were ambushed and massacred, the garrison at Annual itself was raided and seized. Silvestre was killed in the fighting, though the source notes some accounts say it was suicide.
The battle's outcome for the Spanish soldiers was brutal.
Thousands were shot in the back as they fled or hacked to death by sword. The source includes the chilling line that the Rifians cut so many Spanish throats, they eventually became bored with the slaughter, quoting this directly.
The cost in lives and material was immense.
13,192 Spanish lives lost, according to the source, plus the loss of 20,000 Mauser rifles, 400 machine guns, and 129 cannons. It quotes these specific numbers. The disaster was profoundly shocking to the Spanish psyche, leading King Alfonso III to back a military coup, led by the Andalusian general Miguel Primo de Rivera in 1923. Primo de Rivera actually advocated abandoning Morocco altogether.
The aftermath of Annual and the subsequent Spanish retreats were gruesome.
Retreating Spanish soldiers came upon heaps of festering corpses from the Battle of Annual. The source describes how the bodies had been violated, stakes wrapped in barbed wire inserted into them, eyes and genitals removed, bodies beheaded or sawed in half, entrails used as handcuffs. It quotes these specific, horrific atrocities described in the source material.
Primo de Rivera's planned withdrawal was also costly.
Yes, the fighting in 1924 during the retreat was fierce. Rif Berbers captured the city of Chaouen and gained 40 miles of territory. Thousands of Spanish soldiers died in these fighting retreats, often picked off by Berber snipers. The source notes 500 legionarios under a young Francisco Franco were killed on the last day of the retreat alone.
1924 proved to be a high point for Abd el-Krim and his rebellion.
Yes. He received some support, including munitions and food, from businessmen in the international city of Tangier, who perhaps saw him as an underdog fighting for freedom, a view shared by some world opinion at the time. The Islamic world was effusive in its praise, inspiring would-be insurgents elsewhere. And perhaps surprisingly, Europe's communists wholeheartedly supported him. Jacques Doriot, who later became a fascist, and the French Communist Party sent aid. The Comintern in Moscow sent agents, the source naming Sharif Mulay Hassanov and Namber Mahmudov. However, the source also notes el-Krim received funding from German entrepreneurs and used violence and terror to keep the tribes loyal, while playing up his anti-imperial credentials in letters to Latin American leftists.
But el-Krim ultimately faced the much larger and better organized French force in Morocco.
Right. French Morocco is described as a Leviathan. The French forces, including the FFL, Senegalese troops, and Arab units, were generally better trained and equipped, and crucially, the French had cultivated warmer relations with many Berber tribes south of the Rif. General Louis-Hubert Lyautey, the commander of French Morocco, whom the source calls France's greatest colonial soldier, had extensive experience in Indochina and Algeria and believed in the gradual oil slick method.
The French initially struggled against the Riffians too, though.
They did. In 1925, Riffians captured 43 out of 66 French posts along the border and seized French weapons.
Franco-Spanish fortunes finally turned with a major amphibious landing.
Yes, at Alhucemas Bay on September 8, 1925. It involved 13,000 soldiers, mostly Spanish, led by Generals José Sanjuro and Manuel Godin, with significant air and naval support.
And El Krim eventually surrendered to the French.
In 1926, which effectively ended the rebellion. The source notes the French learned from Spanish mistakes regarding fortifications and water supply. They employed combined arms warfare effectively, using air power and large-scale troop movements, and the French Foreign Legion proved its worth in the campaign.
Okay, micro recap number 6. We just discussed the French Foreign Legion in White Hats, White Fighters, their image, reality, key figures like Lyautey, daily life, recruitment, the Cameroon legend, and the source's argument about their identity as a force for Christendom.
Then we unpacked the Plan of San Diego, the Texas borderlands context, the plan's call for race war, the source claiming Mexican government involvement, the Sedicioncitos raids and atrocities, the U.S. response including Columbus and Pershing, the Texas Ranger counterviolence, and the source's extensive modern parallels regarding the border, Mexican influence, and the call for racial consciousness.
And finally, a little-known chapter in the Muslim War against the West. We covered Harvey's account of the FFL in Syria, his critique of Senegalese troops, the transition to Spanish Morocco, the long history back to the Reconquista, Abd el-Krim, and the Rif Rebellion, the catastrophic Spanish defeat at Annual, and the gruesome details provided.
Right, plus El-Krim's international support from communists and others, the French counteroffensive under Lyautey, the decisive Alhucemas Bay landing, and the military lessons learned according to the source.
Good, that's about 35 minutes covered. Our next section looks at a Portuguese poet and a particular strain of nationalism. This section is titled Mystical Nationalism and Ocean Dreams.
Yeah, this introduces Fernando Pessoa, the famous Portuguese poet who lived from 1888 to 1935. He observed dramatic changes in Portugal, especially after the monarchy was dethroned by Republicans like Teofilo Braga in October 1910.
The first Portuguese republic aimed to erase the past, didn't it?
It did. It sought to replace monarchism, reaction, pre-capitalism, and the empire with a new system based on rights and law. Pessoa, being middle class, initially got caught up in the enthusiasm, hoping for a better economic future. However, the source contrasts these materialist hopes with what it called his deeper mystical passions,
leading to his famous book Mensagem, published posthumously in 1934.
No, it was published in 1934, shortly before his death. The source describes it as Pessoa's national epic. It apparently combines Sebastianism, Portuguese national mythology, occultism, esotericism, and nationalism into one work.
Can you explain Sebastianism for us?
Sure. It's a cult that grew up around King Sebastian of Portugal. He died fighting the Moors in Morocco in 1578, but his body was never definitively recovered, leading to his disappearance. This evolved into a Portuguese messiah myth, the belief that Sebastian wasn't dead but hidden and would return on a foggy morning to restore Portugal's glory. It became strongly associated with the Manuelan era, Portugal's golden age of discoveries and empire.
And Pessoa's vision was for a revival of this spirit.
Yes, he sought a revival of the Portuguese spirit, envisioning a third empire. But his vision, the source explains, was primarily spiritual, not material. He called it the Fifth Empire. He wanted to make Portugal a cultural and political power again, but the source notes his vision lacked the overt Christian mysticism of the original Sebastianism. Original Sebastianism, which the source notes is still part of Portuguese reactionary thought, saw King Sebastian, who fought the Moors and kept Portugal out of Castilian hands, as a testament to the God-given glory of the Portuguese nation. Pessoa's was more esoteric.
The First Portuguese Republic itself was highly unstable.
Extremely. It failed quite spectacularly, cycling through 21 governments in just 16 years, which eventually led to a military coup in 1926.
And this brought Antonio de Oliveira Salazar to power.
Yes, eventually leading to his Estado Novo, new state dictatorship, which lasted from 1932 until 1968. The source notes Salazar kept Portugal out of World War II and oversaw a period of economic flourishing and stability. It also states that Salazar's Portugal, along with South Africa and Rhodesia, led the good fight against communism in Africa until 1974, quoting that specific characteristic framing.
The Portuguese Empire eventually ended, though.
Yes, Salazar's successor was removed by the Carnation Revolution in 1974, and the Portuguese Empire was dismantled shortly after.
So how does the source connect Pessoa's mystical vision back to Salazar?
It suggests that by the time Pessoa published Message in 1934, he saw in Salazar's emerging authoritarian state the possibility of achieving a Portuguese Fifth Empire, the spiritual empire he envisioned.
Okay, our next section looks at a very famous American pulp writer and themes of race and civilization in his work. This is titled The Racial Consciousness of Robert E. Howard.
Right, introducing Robert E. Howard, the prolific pulp writer who lived from 1906 to 1936, best known as the creator of Conan the Barbarian, Call of Atlantis, and Solomon Kane. The source immediately flags his work as filled with race and civilization conflict.
Can you describe his background according to the source?
He grew up in various Texas oil boom towns, like Cross Plains. These towns apparently experienced bursts of intense activity, bringing workers, bordellos, and violence. His father was a doctor, but his mother was an invalid, and Howard was her primary caretaker, forming a very close bond that the source notes played a huge role in both his life and his death. His biographer, Rusty Burke, is cited as saying Howard often felt like an outsider.
Howard was primarily a writer, working indoors, but he also took up physical pursuits.
Yes. Apparently feeling physically weak, the source mentions he took digitalis for a heart condition. He started serious weightlifting and boxing around 1928. This leads the source to describe him as a combination of scholarly recluse and man of action. He was a workaday writer, churning out stories, and earned decent money even during the Depression. The source cites his 1934 earnings.
What were the key themes identified in his fiction?
Conflicts between different races and the rise and fall of civilizations. This is especially prominent in the Conan series, which presents a cyclical view of history. Barbarism clashes with civilization, civilization grows decadent and declines, eventually being crushed by a new, more vital barbarism.
Howard seemed to celebrate the barbarians' vitality over civilization.
The source notes he definitely celebrated the strength and vitality of the barbarian archetype and was quite skeptical of civilization as a project, often depicting it as corrupt or weak. Conan himself is presented as the epitome of this. A hyper-masculine white barbarian, a restless adventurer who conquered kingdoms through sheer force and will.
His letters, particularly his correspondence with H.P. Lovecraft and others, reveal more of his personal views.
Yes, the source notes he good-naturedly mocked Lovecraft's support for Italian fascism, Mussolini, and the very concept of civilization. It quotes Mussolini's lines, which Howard cited, "The sword and civilization go hand in hand. Wherever the Italian flag waves, it will carry civilization."
Howard apparently preferred the raw vitality of the barbarian.
Yes, over what he saw as decadent civilization. The source calls him an early anarcho-primitivist. It also cites Stephen Tompkins, who viewed Howard as the penultimate American, a proud offspring of settlers who desired absolute freedom in the wilderness.
But despite these comments in his letters, the source argues his fiction often inclined toward certain types of civilizations or peoples.
Right. The source interprets that many of Howard's best stories are actually about the conflict between masculine Indo-European civilization and absolute barbarity. This is framed as the source's interpretation of his work's underlying themes.
The story Black Canaan is given as a specific example.
Yes. Published in Weird Tales in June 1936, just before his death. It's set in the Texas backwoods and features a black magician, his mixed-race followers, and culminates in a black-white race war. The white protagonist, Steve Costigan, is presented as representing the Anglo-Saxon spirit standing against black magic. The source quotes lines like, "White men could not be driven, the Anglo-Saxon felt the call of the wild, and white devils had no terrors for the Anglo-Saxon." The source interprets this story as reminding modern readers that the U.S. has roots older than 1776 or the Constitution, citing European footprints in Texas dating back to 1545.
Another story, The Marchers of Valhalla, is also mentioned as reflecting his views on American identity.
The source states this story argues North America has long been a frontier for Indo-Europeans, a place where old European rivalries like Anglo-Saxon versus Celt or Germanic versus Latin matter less. Howard's heroes, the source argues, reassert their unique and thoroughly American whiteness within these borderland settings.
How does the source define the American founding stock based on Howard's work?
As primarily Anglo-Celtic, but also including Spanish and French Catholics and Dutch Calvinists, the source argues Americans are a unique people who shouldn't descend into old European rivalries, but be proud of their shared Celto-Germanic and Latin, not mestizo, civilization, quoting this specific definition. This pride, the source argues, should be a bulwark against the vileness of the modern multiculturalist world.
Howard's life ended tragically young.
Yes, he died by suicide on June 11, 1936, shortly after his mother fell into a final coma from which she wouldn't recover. The source contrasts Howard's vision of civilization's weakness with the reality that even in his own boomtown of Cross Plains, the Texas Rangers couldn't entirely stop the violence. Howard saw civilization as inherently weak and barbarism as strong.
And the modern age, according to the source's interpretation of Howard.
It's seen as a Kali Yuga, a dark age, weak and desperately needing the ancient, pre-modern masculine energy found in barbarism. The source connects Howard's ideas to writers like Conrad and Kipling, celebrating imperial creation and adventure, suggesting this vital energy is dormant in the modern American male.
What is the final lesson the source draws from Howard?
The source argues that American nationalists need to remember this legacy, overcome the modern Kali Yuga by embracing the ancient pre-modern and masculine. The source concludes this section by stating explicitly, this is what Howard teaches us.
Okay, micro recap number 7. We just covered the plan of San Diego in detail. Its call for race war, the source's claim of Mexican government backing, the border raids and violence, the U.S. response, Pershing, Rangers, and the source's extensive modern parallels regarding border security, Mexican influence, mestizo supremacy, and the call for racial consciousness.
Then we move to a little-known chapter in the Muslim War against the West, focusing on Harvey's account of the FFL in Syria, his critique of Senegalese troops, the shift to Spanish Morocco, the Rif Rebellion under Abd el-Krim, the disaster at Annual with its gruesome details, el-Krim's international support, including communists, and the eventual Franco-Spanish victory.
Followed by mystical nationalism and ocean dreams, introducing Fernando Pessoa, Sebastianism, his vision of a spiritual fifth empire, the failure of Portugal's First Republic, the rise of Salazar's Estado Novo, and the source linking Pessoa's vision to Salazar's state.
And just now, the racial consciousness of Robert E. Howard. His background, pulp themes of barbarism versus civilization, his letters mocking civilization, the source interpreting his fiction as favoring Indo-European masculinity, examples like Black Canaan and Marchers of Valhalla, the source defining American founding stock, Howard's tragic end, and the source's lesson about embracing pre-modern masculinity to overcome the Kali Yuga.
Right, we're about 40 minutes in. The source then turns to Italian imperialism, specifically in relation to Ethiopia. This section is titled Avenging Adowa, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War.
Yes, introducing Italy's entry into the European scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. The source calls Italy the youngest and weakest of the great powers at the time. It highlights Italy's ignoble distinction, being the only European power to actually lose a major war against an African state during that period, the First Italo-Abyssinian War, culminating in the Battle of Adowa in 1896.
This defeat against Ethiopia, supported by Russia and France, was significant.
Hugely significant. Very high Italian casualties. 15,000 out of an 18,000-man force were casualties. General Oreste Baratieri was decisively defeated, with 7,000 Italians killed or captured. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia was triumphant.
Gruesome details from the aftermath are noted by the source.
Ethiopians apparently mutilated Eritrean soldiers who would remain loyal to Italy, hacking off limbs. Some contemporary newspaper reports, cited by the source, claimed Italian corpses were similarly mutilated.
The defeat triggered a major political crisis back in Italy.
Yes, Prime Minister Francesco Crispi resigned, and there were riots in several Italian cities.
But despite this humiliating defeat, Italy didn't abandon its imperial ambitions.
Not at all. The source suggests the defeat actually inspired movements like futurism, led by figures like Marinetti, clamoring for machines, speed, and new weapons like the airplane. The Italian military looked to Africa again, battling the Ottomans in Libya. The Italo-Ottoman War of 1911-12, where Italy aimed to capture Tripoli in Libya, is called by the source the First Modern War because it saw the first significant use of airplanes in combat. It showed Italy was serious about playing an imperial role.
The figure of Gabriele D'Annunzio is introduced here as a key nationalist figure.
Yes, the poet, writer, and extreme nationalist who famously led the Impresa di Fiume from 1919 to 1920. He created a short-lived free state in the city of Fiume, modern Rijeka, characterized by free love, drugs, anarchy, futurist art and music, and political violence. The source says this put the rest of the world on notice. The source views D'Annunzio's Fiume adventure as heralding a new political force in Italy, demonstrating the power of radical nationalism and heavily influencing the rise of fascism and Benito Mussolini.
leading eventually to Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935.
Right. Mussolini became prime minister in 1922. Italy invaded Ethiopia in October 1935, explicitly framed by the source as revenge for Adowa. Italy used modern weapons extensively, airplanes, tanks, and, controversially, poison gas.
They faced Ethiopian resistance led by Emperor Haile Selassie I.
Yes. The League of Nations condemned Italy's aggression, but ultimately failed to implement effective sanctions. The war received significant coverage, particularly by the left-wing press in Europe and the black press in the U.S. The source notes the black press made heroes of the Ethiopians, portraying them as fighting against worldwide white supremacy.
Black Americans volunteered to fight for Ethiopia.
Hundreds apparently attempted to volunteer. The source specifically mentions a Florida native, John C. Robinson, known as the Brown Condor, who actually went and led the nascent Ethiopian Air Force, the Brown Condor Squadron.
Italy was ultimately victorious in this war.
Yes, they broke the main Ethiopian army at the Battle of Meshu in March 1936 and occupied the country. Haile Selassie went into exile. Italy formally annexed Ethiopia in 1936, and Mussolini proclaimed the birth of a new Italian empire. The source does note, however, that Italy lost to Ethiopia during World War II to combine British and Ethiopian forces, and that the Italian soldiers' fighting reputation suffered greatly due to Italy's overall performance in WWII.
The source then connects this history directly to modern Italian military deployments,
noting Italian troops serving in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and highlighting a recent deployment of up to 470 soldiers to Niger. The Italian Prime Minister at the time, Gentiloni, cited checking the threat of Islamist terrorism as the reason. The source links this to the deaths of U.S. Special Forces in Niger and describes the Sahel region as a home to Muslim bandits affiliated with groups like al-Qaeda.
The source adds another, more controversial reason for the Niger deployment.
Yes, it argues the deployment also serves to counter illegal migration, as Niger is a key transit route for sub-Saharan Africans attempting to reach Europe. Italy is also deploying forces to Libya and Tunisia, former colonies now experiencing civil war and unrest involving Muslim terrorist gangs, according to the source.
The source critiques the view of the post-colonial anti-white left,
stating they see these modern deployments as merely a repeat of past injustice and colonialism.
Okay, here's where the source offers a very controversial argument about whether Italian colonization was actually beneficial.
Right. While acknowledging that left-wing critics are correct about human rights violations under Italian rule, the source argues that the history is not as villainous as it is usually depicted, quoting that phrase directly.
And it asserts that the lives of Africans under Italian rule actually improved.
Yes, claiming the lives of Italy's African citizens improved under Rome's direction, particularly in Italian East Africa, which combined Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. It argues the Royal Italian Army was beneficial for Abyssinians, especially from the Tigray region, and Eritreans, as many learned to read and write while serving in uniform.
The source also challenges the standard narrative of economic exploitation,
arguing that Italy actually lost money running its African empire, which the source claims demonstrates, quote, the lie behind the oft-repeated shibboleth that imperialism was all about economic exploitation, quoting this specific argument.
Specific examples of improvements are provided.
Mogadishu, in Italian Somaliland, is cited as having become a first-class city due to Italian investment in farms, schools, an airport, and even a branch of the Banca d'Italia. The Duke of Aosta, who governed Italian East Africa, is noted for formally abolishing slavery in Abyssinia, with similar anti-slavery laws enacted elsewhere in Italian territories.
The source then brings this argument back to the modern deployments in Africa,
expressing the hope that Italy's limited role in Niger may help to stem the rising tide of color pouring into Europe, explicitly quoting this highly charged phrasing.
And it addresses potential liberal reactions to this view.
Acknowledging American liberals may scoff at these antiquated fears, the source contrasts this with the example of Castelvolturno in Italy. It describes Castelvolturno as a town with a large black immigrant population, high crime rates, prostitution, lacking municipal control, and featuring an alliance between Nigerian organized crime and the Italian mafia.
So what is the source's final suggestion regarding the use of military and police forces?
The source proposes that military and police should be used domestically to enforce immigration laws and, quote, keep the migrants there, framing this as a direct policy proposal stemming from its analysis.
Okay, that's end of chapter mega recap number 2. We covered the Chinese uprising against whites, detailing the Boxer Rebellion, the siege, the international response, the source linking it to later conflicts and CCP actions.
Then, white hats, white fighters on the French Foreign Legion image versus reality, Blanchard, Liadi, Junger, Cameron, and the source's interpretation of their identity as defenders of Christendom.
Followed by the Plan of San Diego, the border context, the plan itself claimed Mexican government involvement, the raids, U.S. response, ranger violence, and the source's modern parallels on immigration and racial consciousness.
Then, a little-known chapter in the Muslim War against the West Harvey's FFL account in Syria, the critique of Senegalese troops, the shift to Spanish Morocco, the Rif War, Abd el-Krim, the annual disaster and atrocities, communist support for el-Krim, and the Franco-Spanish victory.
And just now, mystical nationalism and ocean dreams. Pessoa, Sebastianism, the Fifth Empire concept, Salazar's Estado Novo, and the link between Pessoa's vision and Salazar's regime.
All right, flashcard time for this block. O. Harvey, FFL in Syria. Source highlights his criticism of Senegalese troops as useless, needing whipping. O. Spanish Morocco. Key locations: Soutamalia. Focus on Rif Berbers. Obard el-Krim, leader of the Rif rebellion against both Spanish and French. O. Battle of Annual, 1921. Major Spanish defeat, high casualties. Source details, widespread mutilation of bodies. O. el-Krim support. Source notes backing from Islamic world, European communists. Doriot, Crimeans listed. O. French counter. Generality's oil slick method, key role of FFL, decisive Al-Husimas Bay landing, 1925.
And a provocative question based only on the source's graphic details. The source highlights graphic details of atrocities in the Rif War. How does this perspective, as presented, challenge potentially more sanitized narratives of colonial conflict?
A fair question based on the text's emphasis.
Moving on, the source returns to the theme of the Yellow Peril, but this time through popular culture. This section is titled, Fighting the Yellow Peril.
Yes, reintroducing the theme, specifically as seen in a popular Belgian comic series, Blake and Mortimer, created by Edgar P. Jacobs. The series began in 1946 with the U-Ray, but the source focuses on a major story arc called The Secret of the Swordfish, published between 1950 and 1953.
This arc introduced the main heroes and villains.
Exactly. The heroes are Captain Francis Blake of British Intelligence, MI5, and Professor Philip Mortimer, a leading scientist. The main villains introduced here are Colonel Ulrich and the shadowy Yellow Empire.
Can you describe the plot of The Secret of the Swordfish as summarized by the source?
The conflict centers on the Yellow Empire, depicted as a technologically advanced Pan-Asian military force led by Emperor Basamdamdu, who seeks total world domination. Their tactics involve using state-of-the-art weapons for the time rockets, jet fighters, paratroopers in a massive surprise attack. Their stated goal is to outdo Genghis Khan.
And they are initially very successful in the story.
Extremely. Emperor Damdu, according to the source's summary, boasts about crushing Rome, Paris, and London, bringing the British Empire, its colonies, and its American allies to their knees.
But the West isn't completely defeated.
No, the source emphasizes the West is far from defeated. The heroes, Blake and Mortimer, manage to escape the destruction and use a secret weapon. They develop the Swordfish, a super-advanced submersible fighter plane or flying wing to fight back against the Yellow Empire. Ultimately, they succeed in defeating the Yellow Empire, although the villain Ulrich survives to become a recurring antagonist in the series.
The source notes that Jacobs updated the classic Yellow Peril theme with modern technology.
Yes. Instead of hordes, it's advanced weaponry like jets and rockets, reflecting post-WWII anxieties.
How does the source interpret the Yellow Empire's role in the comic?
The source explicitly states that, in its view, the Yellow Empire served as a stand-in for communism during the Cold War. This is presented as the source's interpretation of the comic subtext.
And Blake and Mortimer's role in that interpretation.
Again, the source explicitly states they acted as defenders of Western civilization, Europe and America, against this thinly veiled communist threat.
These themes apparently continue in later graphic novels produced after Jacobs' death.
The source mentions two examples. The Valley of the Immortals, published 2018, story said earlier, features a Chinese emperor Shi Li, descendant of the mythical Huangdi, wanting to unite China, including Hong Kong and Macau. Blake and Mortimer fight him from Hong Kong, portrayed as a European outpost, allied with anti-communist Chinese, while Shi Li is allied with Mao Zedong. Another example, the Voronov plot, 2010, is described as directly denouncing Soviet communism.
What is the source's argument for the series' enduring popularity? Why does it think people still read it?
The source argues its popularity serves as a timely reminder that readers in the West still hanker for proud imperial adventures featuring strong white male characters, quoting that specific phrasing.
Blake and Mortimer are contrasted favorably with modern figures.
Yes, the source states they are not chicken-chested weaklings, unlike perceived modern figures. They are seen as reminiscent of heroic British imperial figures and pulp heroes of the past, embodying adventure and heroism that the source suggests is lacking today.
Okay, micro recap number 8. We covered mystical nationalism and ocean dreams, focusing on Pessoa, Sebastianism, the Fifth Empire, Salazar's Estado Novo, and the connection drawn by the source.
Then we delved into the racial consciousness of Robert E. Howard, his background, themes of barbarism versus civilization, his skepticism of civilization in letters, the source's interpretation of his fiction favoring Indo-European masculinity using Black Canaan and Marches of Valhalla as examples, and the source's concluding lesson about embracing pre-modern masculinity.
Followed by Avenging Adowa, Italy's Defeat, Futurism, Denuncio, Mussolini's Invasion of Ethiopia, the Brown Condor Detail, Modern Italian Deployments in Africa, the source's controversial argument that Italian colonization was beneficial despite abuses, and the link to stemming migration, Rising Tide of Color.
And just now, Fighting the Yellow Peril through the Blake and Mortimer comics, The Secret of the Swordfish Plot, the source interpreting the Yellow Empire as communism and the heroes as defenders of the West, and its argument that the series' popularity shows a longing for imperial adventures with strong, white male leads.
Right, about 50 minutes covered. The source then turns back to post-colonial Africa, focusing on a specific, controversial figure from Kenya's history. This section is titled, Kenya's National Hero, a Terrorist.
Yeah, this introduces Dedan Kimathi, presented by the source as Kenya's official national hero. It mentions the symbols of this status, a street named after him in Nairobi, a university in Nyeri. The source quotes its own framing. Kenyan men, especially those belonging to Kimathi's own Kikuyu tribe, are encouraged to be like the man who fought the British during the Mau Mau Rebellion of the 1950s.
But the source immediately contrasts this official hero narrative with a specific book, Ian Henderson and Philip Goodhart's Manhunt in Kenya, published in 1958.
Right. The source states that the larger-than-life version of Kimathi, the freedom fighter, intellectual martyr, is completely absent from this book. Instead, the book describes Henderson, a colonial police officer, and Europeans hunting Kimathi down.
Can you describe Henderson's background as presented?
He was British, but born in Kenya in 1929, grew up on a farm. He volunteered for the British colonial police at 18, right after WWII ended. His physical fitness and, crucially, his Kikuyu language skills became invaluable after the Mau Mau uprising began around 1950.
What does the source say about the origins of the Mau Mau movement itself?
It notes the origins, and even the name are not entirely known, with conflicting accounts. Henderson and Goodhart, in their book, were convinced the movement was created and directed by Jomo Kenyatta and his Kenyan African National Union, KANU Party. Though the source notes other historians rarely make this direct claim, often blaming British violence for fueling the uprising. What observers generally agree on, according to the source, is that the Mau Mau loathed the British and all white people and saw violence as the easiest path to gain independence, primarily for the Kikuyu people.
Early members were trade unionists and radical students.
Yes, initially in Nairobi and Nyeri. They then moved into Kikuyu settlements and took part in intense oath-swearing ceremonies, oaths of secrecy and loyalty, with extreme consequences promised for breaking them.
The source does mention landlessness as a key reason for the uprising.
It states the violence was a direct response to landlessness, as Kikuyu had lost significant land to white settlers and the colonial government over decades. Resentment boiled over in 1952.
Early Mau Mau actions involved killing European farmers' livestock.
Yes, killed and disemboweled sheep and cows. The first significant murder, according to the source, was Senior Chief Waruhi Kungu, a prominent Kikuyu chief whom the Mau Mau saw as a traitor to their cause. He was shot in his car near Nairobi. This assassination forced the governor, Evelyn Baring, to declare a state of emergency. This allowed British officials to start joint police and military operations and, importantly, implement villagization.
Villagization involved putting Kikuyus into detention camps.
Yes, a strategy that had been successful against communist insurgents in British Malaya. However, the source notes it didn't stop the Mau Mau killings in Kenya. The source then details several gruesome murders of both Europeans and Africans attributed to the Mau Mau.
Can you recount the specific atrocities mentioned?
In September-October 1952, Mau Mau fighters stabbed 2 British women to death on a farm near Thika. In January 1953, about 30 Mau Mau members killed the Rook family, a farmer, his pregnant wife, and their 6-year-old son in their Rift Valley home. Newspapers at the time reported they were mutilated. The source quotes these specifics. In March 1953, Bernard Gray, a British farmer, was killed. The source states Mau Mau took him into the Mount Kenya forests, ate parts of his body, and buried him alive upside down. It quotes this horrific detail directly.
The total number of Mau Mau martyrs is also noted.
According to the source, citing figures presumably from the era or Henderson's book, 32 Europeans, many Asians, mostly Indians, and thousands of Africans were killed by the Mau Mau. The worst single Mau Mau atrocity described was the murder of approximately 100 Kikuyu, many of whom belonged to the pro-British Kikuyu Home Guard.
So how did the British and loyalist Kikuyu forces respond effectively?
In late 1955, the police implemented a plan focused on capturing and then turning former Mau Mau fighters into pro-British collaborators. This led to the creation of the pseudo-gangs.
Describe the pseudo-gang method.
These gangs consisted of former Mau Mau members, now turned, leading security forces, comprising British officers and loyal Kikuyus. They dressed like Mau Mau, acted like Mau Mau, and hunted down the actual Mau Mau fighters in the forests. The method involved turning, captured Mau Mau leaders and fighters, sometimes through torture, sometimes persuasion, and then forcing them to lead operations against their former comrades. Ian Henderson, the author of the source book, created one such unit called Group 3.
And Henderson's group eventually captured Kimathi himself.
Yes, on October 21st, 1956. They used a tracking dog. Kikuyu members of Henderson's gang cornered and shot Kimathi, wounding him. They took him to a police post, where Henderson ordered his leg bandaged. Kimathi was then taken to Nairi Hospital, where Henderson visited him and asked him questions.
And Kimathi's fate.
He was tried, and the judge apparently used Henderson's interrogation notes as evidence. Kimathi was found guilty and hanged on February 18, 1957.
The source presents the pseudo-gang method as the key to defeating the Mau Mau.
Yes. Henderson's book highlights this method, focusing on hunting down the leadership, as critical to the victory, which the source frames as a victory for both the British and the Kikuyu loyalists who opposed the Mau Mau.
And what is the source's final argument about historical revisionism regarding Kimathi?
It argues that the post-independence Kenyan government deliberately elevated Kimathi to hero status, creating that larger-than-life narrative while ignoring the violence attributed to him and the Mau Mau. He was celebrated purely as an anti-colonial fighter. The source's explicit conclusion is that this serves as an example of how post-colonial governments rewrite history and intentionally celebrate terrorists as heroes. That's the final takeaway presented.
Okay, end of chapter, mega recap number 3. We started with Avenging Adowa, covering Italy's 1896 defeat, futurism, D'Annunzio's influence, Mussolini's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, the use of modern tech, the Brown Condor, Italy's victory and later loss. Then the source connected this to modern Italian deployments in Africa, Niger, Libya, Tunisia, arguing controversially that Italian colonization was actually beneficial despite HR violations, citing infrastructure, abolition of slavery, arguing Italy lost money, and linking modern deployments to stemming migration, rising tide of color.
Then we discussed Fighting the Yellow Peril via the Blake and Mortimer comics, The Secret of the Swordfish Plot, the Yellow Empire representing communism, Blake and Mortimer defending the West, and the source arguing the series' popularity shows a modern hankering for proud imperial adventures featuring strong white male characters.
And just now, Kenya's national hero, a terrorist, contrasting the official narrative of Dedan Kimathi with Henderson's book, detailing Mau Mau origins, oathing ceremonies, landlessness as a cause, horrific atrocities committed by Mau Mau, Ruck family, Bernard Gray, Home Guard massacre.
Right, and the British loyalist response using the pseudo-gangs to turn rebels, Henderson's role, Kimathi's capture and execution, and the source's concluding argument that post-colonial governments like Kenya rewrite history to celebrate figures the source labels terrorists. Flashcard bullets for this block. Battle of Adowa, 1896. Source emphasizes this Italian defeat versus Ethiopians, supported by Russia-France. So Second Italo-Ethiopian War, 1935-36. Source frames as Mussolini's revenge, highlights modern tech use, mentions Brown Condor, John C. Robinson. Source's argument, Italian colonization, controversially presented as beneficial, improved lives, lost money, abolished slavery, despite acknowledged HR violations. Those modern Italian deployments, Niger, Libya, Tunisia source, links to fighting terrorism and explicitly to stemming migration, rising tide of color.
And a provocative question based only on the source's claims. The source argues Italian colonization, despite acknowledged human rights violations, was a net positive for Africans. What specific examples, like infrastructure or abolishing slavery, does the source use to support this controversial claim?
That captures the source's specific justification points.
All right, our next section looks at a famous, or perhaps infamous, mercenary figure active in Africa. This is titled White Giant Mad Mike Hoare.
Yes, introducing Mike Hoare, the Irish mercenary who lived from 1919 to 2017. He's best known for leading the mercenary unit known as 5 Commando, nicknamed the Wild Geese, during the Congo crisis in the 1960s. His book, Congo Mercenary, was the inspiration for the 1978 film The Wild Geese, although the source notes the film mercenaries were portrayed as slightly more romantic or roguish than Hoare's actual men.
What motivated the mercenaries who joined 5 Commando, according to the source?
They came from various places: South Africa, Rhodesia, West Germany, Italy. The source quotes Hoare's book directly on their motivation. Much as I would like to say that we were motivated by anti-communist sentiments, I am unable, in truth, to say it was so. It was a purely mercenary enterprise. The source connects the Wild Geese nickname of 5 Commando back to the 19,000 Irish mercenaries who served Catholic European kingdoms in the 18th century, also known as the Wild Geese. It notes Hoare was aware of this history.
The source also characterizes Hoare himself as quite an astute observer.
Yes, of geopolitics, sociology, and race. The source suggests that people on the dissident right might label him an early race realist.
And what was Hoare's view on what the Congo needed, according to the source?
The source states quite plainly that Hoare made no bones in his writings about what could cure Congo and all sub-Saharan Africa: European control and rule of law. It connects this later to arguments made by Bruce Gilley about the benefits of colonialism.
Can you briefly describe the Congo crisis context after Belgian Congo gained independence on June 30, 1960?
It was immediate chaos. Mutinies in the army, civil war breaking out, most notably the secession of the wealthy Katanga province led by Moise Tshombe. This pitted the first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, against Tshombe. It quickly took on a Cold War dimension. Lumumba sought Soviet and Chinese aid, while Tshombe looked for Western support. The source notes the U.S. and UN got involved, with the U.S. fearing being branded racist, even though it knew Lumumba was seeking communist assistance.
UN troops were sent, including Irish soldiers who fought at the siege of Jedoville.
Yes, in 1961. The source acknowledges the Irish heroism against the Katanga gendarmerie and mercenaries there, but argues the Irish were effectively fighting for a Congolese central government that was trying to force Katanga back into the Union by military means, thereby extending Lumumba's legacy, something the source calls toxic to Tshombe, the white population, and anti-Lumumba tribes. That's the source's specific interpretation.
Lumumba's arrest and execution are also mentioned.
In early 1961, the source cites a 1961 International Commission, which found Lumumba's execution was ordered by Tshombe and carried out by the Katanga gendarmerie. It contrasts this finding with what it calls the left-wing academic view, blaming the CIA and MI6.
White citizens fled the chaos elsewhere and concentrated in Katanga?
Yes. Riots in 1960 saw 800 Belgian paratroopers briefly return to Elizabethville, now Lubumbashi, at Tshombe's request to put down a mutiny where 6 whites had been killed. But African protests and UN pressure soon forced the Belgian troops to leave.
By 1964, a new pro-communist rebellion flared up.
Yes, the Belgian presence had dwindled significantly. The Congolese National Army proved incapable of putting down a pro-communist rebellion that started in Kwilu province. The rebels received unchecked aid from neighboring Uganda and the Sudan, according to the source. The rebellion conquered 2/3 of the entire nation in just 5 months. UN troops continued to withdraw.
This is when Tshombe, formerly exiled after Katanga's secession failed, became Prime Minister of the Central Congo government. He needed a capable fighting force.
Desperately. He needed someone to fight the Simba rebels, who were described by the source as Maoist, fiercely anti-Western, and anti-white. They received aid from the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and Algeria.
This is where Tshombe hires Mike Hoare.
Right. Hoare, a former British Army officer who'd become an accountant but then served as a mercenary in the Katanga police force earlier, got the green light from Tshombe to raise a mercenary army of about 1,000 men. Recruitment was apparently quite simple. The source quotes the newspaper ad placed in Johannesburg and Salisbury, now Harare. Any fit young man looking for employment with a salary of £250 a month apply box.
The men who responded were a mix.
Adventurers, idealists, ex-soldiers, some explicitly wanting to defend white civilization, but also some from criminal backgrounds or extremist groups, like the French OAS. The source mentions a mercenary named Jungles. The source notes Hoare tended to play down the eccentricities in his book, lauding their soldiering skills, bravery, and idealism. It contrasts this with critics like Germani, who detailed their perceived softness. It also mentions a photo showing jungles carrying a young black child to safety. The rebels apparently called the mercenaries les affreux, the frightful ones, but also white giants,
The source draws a sharp contrast between the commandos and the Simba rebels.
stating quite starkly, the humanity of the commandos contrasted drastically with the utter savagery of the rebels, quoting that line.
Describe the Simba rebel actions detailed by the source.
Killings, cannibalism, torture, and human sacrifice are mentioned. These acts were often carried out, according to the source, in front of shrines dedicated to Patrice Lumumba, who had become a kind of anti-white fetish for the rebels. The source again quotes Germani describing the 1964 rebellion as, quote, fanatic movement against the white man, an appeal to wild dreams of a colored dominion of the world, quoting this specific line again, emphasizing the source's view that this was the core motivation behind the rebellion. The source's interpretation is that the rebellion was fundamentally an atavistic revolt with just a patina of orthodox communism at the very top. This is presented as the source's analysis.
The rebels also had strong superstitions.
Yes, they believed amulets and rituals made them invincible to bullets, causing them to run directly at machine guns. The source comments that death can sometimes be stupid, and that many died for Lumumba and Mao and then got eaten, quoting these specific, rather grim points.
The Battle of Stanleyville, now Kisangani, in November 1964 is a key event, focusing on a hostage rescue mission.
Right. Belgian paratroopers were dropped in Operation Dragon Rouge to rescue hundreds of white hostages held by the Simba rebels. Simultaneously, HOR's 5 Commando raced towards the city by land and river. The paratroopers secured the airport quickly and raced towards the Hotel Victoria, where most of the white civilians were held. But the source states they were too late to stop the murder of those white civilians.
The source quotes the rebel leader Gabenia's command given that morning.
Yes, broadcast over radio and printed in newspapers. Siuga, Siuga, kill, kill, kill all the white people. Kill all the men, women, and children. Kill them all. Have no scruples. Use your knives and your pangas. The source quotes this explicit command. The Belgian paratroopers were apparently only 2 miles away when this evisceration happened.
The source includes a critique of the journalist coverage of the Congo crisis.
It does. Referring to the journalists covering the Congo as media celebrities, youthful wannabe acolytes, and products of increasingly ideological liberal arts colleges and universities, it labels them agitprop artists. It cites the Tet Offensive in Vietnam as an example of a military disaster turned into a propaganda victory through skewed reporting, and quotes journalist Simonetto, witnessing reporters twisting facts at the Battle of Hue. The source's argument is that this inherent bias undoubtedly colored their reporting from the Congo.
FAMAS Commando apparently realized the world didn't want to hear about the communist backing of the Simba rebels.
The source argues 5 Commando realized the world, especially the West, did not want to know that the Simba rebels carried out their massacres thanks to Chinese guns, Uganda mercenaries, and Cuban and Algerian trainers, quoting this realization. The source argues that by 1965, the rebels were receiving direct communist aid, while the pro-Western forces under Chaume received terribly little support from Europe or America.
The source then argues HOR and 5 Commando became victims of their own success.
Yes. By late 1965, Chaume was removed from power by a political rival amid a political crisis and military coup led by Mobutu Sese Seko. Closer collaboration between Leopoldville, Kinshasa, and Brazzaville across the river allowed left-wing agitators from Brazzaville to enter the DRC and foment unrest. Even before 5 Commando destroyed the last rebel strongholds, left-wing protesters ransacked Leopoldville, burned the Belgian flag, and defiled a statue of King Leopold II.
The politicians then canceled HOR's contract.
Yes, and disbanded 5 Commando. Germani, the critic cited earlier, called this the destruction of the white giant, quoting that phrase. The source argues that the Belgians and HOR's men had maintained the Congo as a civilized, economically powerful state, but their victories were discarded like waste by cowardly politicians, quoting this comparison.
What is the source's explicit final conclusion on the Congo's problems today?
All the problems of the Congo today are the fault of the Congolese and the Congolese government. The source states Mike Hoare recognized this back in 1967 and asserts it still holds true today. That's presented as the source's final word on the Congo.
All right, micro recap number 9. We covered Robert E. Howard's racial consciousness, his background, themes of barbarism, civilization, his letters, the source interpreting his fiction, Black Canaan, Marchers of Valhalla, defining American identity, and the source's lesson on pre-modern masculinity.
Then Avenging Adowa, Italy's 1896 defeat, Futurism, Denuncio, Mussolini's invasion, the Brown Condor, Modern deployments, the source arguing Italian colonization was beneficial and linking it to stemming migration.
Followed by Fighting the Yellow Peril via Blape and Mortimer Comics, The Secret of the Swordfish, interpreting the Yellow Empire as communism, Heroes Defending the West, and the source seeing its popularity reflecting a desire for imperial adventures.
And just now, White Giant, Mad Mike Hoare, The Congo Crisis, Mercenary Motivations, Hoare's Views, Lumumba versus Shome, sources take on Jidoville Lumumba's death, The Simba Rebellion, Savagery and Communist Backing, The Stanleyville Rescue Massacre, Critique of Journalists, and the source blaming politicians for undoing Hoare's success and concluding Congo's problems are its own fault.
Okay, about 55 minutes in. Our next section uses a fictional character again, James Bond, to introduce a real-world figure and discuss Britain's decline. This section is titled Jock's Law, Mad Mitch, and Britain's Last Days in Aden.
Yes, using Ian Fleming's James Bond novels as providing a glimpse into the mind of a British Tory during the last days of the British Empire. It specifically cites You Only Live Twice, where the Japanese character Tiger Tanaka criticizes Britain for losing or throwing away its empire. The source quotes Tanaka's lines about Britain having the empire but losing the will.
Bond's response in the novel is described as weak.
Yes, and the source connects this to Fleming's own patriotism, described in a 1964 Playboy interview, which the source dismisses as mere tax chauvinism, arguing it's all the proud British man had left. Both Bond and Fleming, the source suggests, recognize that Britain won World War II but lost its empire anyway.
The source blames this loss squarely on Britain volunteering for socialist state planning that wrecked its economy for decades, quoting this analysis directly.
Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell is then introduced as a real-world parallel to this imperial Tory complaint or mindset. He's described as a Londoner by birth, but a Scotsman by blood, fiercely loyal to his regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, his father's regiment too.
WWII is framed here as the last great gasp of Britain's imperial army.
Yes, noting the irony of the vastly outnumbered British and Indian army defeating the Japanese at Kohima, killing 6,000 out of 12,000 attackers, only for Britain to later hand over Kenya to black nationalists after defeating the Mau Mau.
A shared frustration between British junior officers and the U.S. military is highlighted again.
The source notes British commanders, especially junior officers, complain their government and public lacked the will to win the small counterinsurgency wars of decolonization, drawing a parallel to the U.S. military's experience in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This is framed as a shared frustration noted by the source.
The political context includes Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's famous Wind of Change speech in 1960.
The source argues this speech signaled Britain effectively abandoning its international standing under pressure from the Soviets and Americans. It told the white minority governments of South Africa and Rhodesia that the defense of Western values in Africa would henceforth be left to them alone. The source concludes grimly that those Western values are buried under a pile of Marxist-Leninist corpses, quoting this line. The source notes the British military increasingly became just an extension of the civil service during this period.
Mitchell, however, rejected this mindset.
Yes, the source notes he jokingly referred to himself as a nigger-bashing imperialist, using the offensive term, specifically to contrast himself with the modern civil service type of officer emerging. His extensive combat experience is listed. Argenta Gap in WWII, Kenya, Malaya, Korea, and Borneo, where he made an unofficial attempt to prevent Indonesian occupation of Malaysia.
Describe the specific situation in Aden, South Arabia at the time.
Aden was a British colony and protectorate, a vital strategic port, and the main base for the British military in the Middle East and East Africa. Britain was planning to withdraw in the late 1960s. Two main Arab nationalist groups, FLOSI, Front for the Liberation of Occupied South Yemen, and the NLF, National Liberation Front, were fighting each other and the British. They effectively controlled the streets, attracting what the source calls detribalized Adeni. Cairo Radio, promoting Gamal Abdel Nasser's Arab Marxism, was seen as the engine propagating anti-Western ideas.
Arabists within the British Army apparently didn't trust the local Adeni population.
No, referring to them with derogatory terms like loafers and souk rats, which the source quotes. The Labour government back in Britain, meanwhile, tended to identify with the nationalists due to shared left-wing labor union sympathies.
This resulted in a policy of inaction for British troops.
Essentially, yes. A permanent freeze on British combat operations. Troops were just meant to train their replacements in the fledgling South Arabian army and then leave. But FLOSI and the NLF had other ideas.
A reign of terror unfolded between 1961 and 1967.
Yes, targeting British Army personnel, their Arab supporters, and British civilians. The source highlights two incidents. December 10, 1963, an NLF grenade attack on the High Commissioner, Sir Kennedy Travasky's, killed 2 and wounded 24. Even more infamous, according to the source, was December 23, 1964, when the NLF threw a grenade into an RAF officer's Christmas party, killing a 16-year-old girl. A total of 3,710 terrorist incidents were recorded between 1964 and 1967. The source quotes this number.
The British Army maintained a passive stance until a crucial event, a mutiny.
Right. That changed everything on June 19, 1967. Fultecan and NLF agents within the British-trained Aden Armed Police mutinied, killing 22 members of the British 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment, 1 para. The source quotes this event. This mutiny finally triggered a British fightback. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Mitchell's Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders were ordered to retake the crater district of Aden, where no white face had been seen for days.
Mitchell employed some unconventional tactics.
Most famously, using the regiment's bagpipes during the assault, which apparently terrified the enemy to death, quoting the source. The pipes were a powerful symbol of Scotland and the regiment. The British press quickly dubbed him Mad Mitch, due to his flagrant disregard for restrictive orders from higher command.
His approach to controlling the retaken district became known as Jock's Law.
Yes. Mitchell demoralized the Arab population by unleashing the full wrath of his soldiers. It became known as Jock's Law. Jocks being slang for Scottish soldiers like Tommy for English. The source describes it as a type of tribal warfare, where the Highlanders acted more like conquerors than a regiment preparing to leave soon. They became a law unto themselves.
The brutality involved is detailed by the source.
Beating suspected terrorists openly in the street or at their HQ, stealing money from Adini locals, referred to with the slur wogs. Much of this brutality was captured on camera by journalists.
But the British public reacted positively.
Yes. The source notes, to the surprise of the Wilson government, the British public loved it. The birth of Jock's Law made Mad Mitch a national hero back home.
What is the source's argument about Mitchell's legacy?
It notes later, historians characterize Mitchell as a surreal relic of Britain's colonial past, a crazed fusion of the Celtic madman, belligerent imperialist, and cantankerous military commander, quoting this description. He angered the British establishment by thumbing his nose at their plan for a graceful exit. The army effectively punished him by ensuring he received no further promotion. But, the source argues, Mad Mitch proved that pure violence can be more effective in controlling unruly populations than the velvet glove treatment. This is framed as the source's key takeaway from his actions. The source calls the Jocks of Mitchell's regiment the last true fighting British soldiers, quoting this specific phrase.
The source concludes their actions showed Britain could still win these conflicts, but lacked the political will.
Exactly. The final retreat from Aden is portrayed as a cowardly political decision that handed control to Marxists. The NLF eventually won the civil war against Flosway. The NLF created the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, PDRY, essentially a Soviet satellite state. Terrorism continued against the remaining British and the South Arabian Army until the last British troops left on November 29, 1967. The NLF took over completely. The PDRY eventually collapsed in 1990 with the unification of Yemen.
What is the source's final judgment on Aden today?
That it's mired in poverty, home to radical Islamists, and racked by civil war. The source concludes bluntly, British failure left behind a mess.
Okay, micro recap number 10. We just discussed fighting the Yellow Peril through the Blake and Mortimer comics, the plot of The Secret of the Swordfish, the source interpreting the Yellow Empire as communism and the heroes as defenders of Western civilization, and its argument about the series' popularity reflecting a hankering for imperial adventures and strong white male characters.
And before that, Avenging Adowa, Italy's defeat, futurism, D'Annunzio, Mussolini's invasion, the Brown Condor, modern deployments, the source arguing Italian colonization was beneficial, and linking it to stemming migration.
Right. About 65 minutes covered. Our final content section looks at an American figure who fought in the Rhodesian Bush War. This is titled A Warrior Scholar's Fight for Rhodesia.
Yes, introducing Alan Coey, an American who lived from 1949 to 1975. The source describes him as a warrior scholar. He was a forestry student at Ohio State University who dropped out to join the Rhodesian Army during the Bush War. His story ends tragically when he died in 1975 from stepping on a landmine. The source material for this section comes from Coey's own diary entries, letters home, and articles he published.
How did Coey view the world, according to the source material presented?
He saw Rhodesia, South Africa, and Portuguese Africa, Angola, and Mozambique as the last bastions against communism, quoting that specific phrase. He was highly critical of U.S. policy, describing Nixon's Vietnamization strategy as nothing short of cutting and running, quoting his words. The source compares his mindset to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's, who also denounced U.S. politicians and students for abandoning the Vietnamese.
Coe became disenchanted with America itself.
Apparently so. After getting his degree in 1972, he dropped a planned commission in the U.S. Marine Corps and went straight to Rhodesia instead. He viewed the U.S. and Western Europe as decadent, consumed by what he saw as a destructive cultural revolution, the hippie movement anti-war protests. He also believed the left wing had been totally co-opted by global finance, calling them the real revolutionaries of internationalism, which is quite a phrasing.
The source speculates on Coe's potential intellectual influences.
Yes, suggesting Coe likely had at least a working knowledge of dissident right authors like Oswald Spengler or Francis Parker Yockey, though this is speculation based on his writings. The source explicitly compares Coe to Ernst Jünger, the German writer and WWI officer known for his ideas about total mobilization, against what he saw as liberal bourgeois cancers. It specifically references Jünger's concept of the anarch, the lone individual who maintains inner discipline and becomes the ultimate survivor outside mainstream society. The source suggests Coe embodied this archetype. Coe apparently often clashed with the official line from Salisbury, Rhodesia's capital, and had issues with what he perceived as the lackluster political intelligence of everyday white Rhodesians.
But despite these clashes, Coe served Rhodesia with distinction.
Yes, due to his adherence to his principles. The force argues that Rhodesia, in its view, came the closest of any state to challenging the post-war triumphalism of globalists. This is presented as the source's interpretation of Rhodesia's significance.
Coe's independent nature cost him a position in the elite Rhodesian SS.
It did. In 1973, he was recognized as the best recruit trooper in his intake, but failed the SAS officer selection course, likely due to his outspokenness. Around this time, he began writing articles for Rhodesian and South African magazines under the pen name John McCoy.
Describe Coe's views on Western civilization and race as analyzed by the source, based on his writings.
The source states Coe believed Western civilization was severely weakened by liberalism and consumerism, needing urgent renewal, similar themes to Robert E. Howard. He admired Rhodesian society, which he saw as achieving multiracial cooperation based on what the source calls a racial hierarchy. The source interprets Coe's fight as being for civilization, not just race per se, noting his combat experience showed him Africans could fight well. But he fundamentally believed, according to this interpretation, that only Western civilization could build and maintain a modern state, with Rhodesia as the prime example. He was critical of white Rhodesians that clung to a comfortable life, failing to appreciate the true nature of the threat they faced.
The source notes Coe has been criticized by some historians.
Yes. It mentions Marxist historian Gerald Horne labeled Coe a white supremacist in his book about U.S. involvement in the Rhodesian Bush War. Horne also characterized Coe as paranoid about Chinese involvement in Africa.
But the source explicitly argues Coe was right about China.
Yes, stating, current events have proven Coe far more in tune with geopolitical realities than the academic Horne, citing China's extensive modern involvement across Africa. The source concludes Coe was more astute about reality than his contemporaries or later critics.
Coe saw cultural rot as destroying healthy societies,
and believed breaking the grip of the new order required a counter-revolution. This counter-revolution, in his view, had to both preserve the valuable aspects of the past and create a better, more vital vision of progress for the future. The source connects this idea to Guillaume Fay's concept of archaeofuturism, which combines archaic values with futuristic technology. The source argues Coe realized a fundamental truth, that race realism without a social conservative's hatred for free love and secular values is doomed to recreate the same fallen society, quoting this specific point about combining racial and social conservatism.
How does the source describe Coe's death and ultimate legacy?
Coe apparently saw dying in Rhodesia as meaningful, a stark contrast to what he perceived as meaningless death in the decadent West. He felt he died fighting for something real, not abstract ideals. He was killed in combat against ZANU guerrillas, Robert Mugabe's Marxist group, by a landmine in 1975 at the young age of 24. His legacy, as presented by the source, is that of a warrior scholar who understood the fight was fundamentally civilizational.
And the source connects this directly back to the book's overarching theme.
Yes, implying Coe exemplified the need to fight the war that the book constantly refers to with the phrase, "The war is now."
Okay, this brings us to the final section of the source material, which essentially serves as the book's conclusion. It's titled simply, "The State of Things."
Right, and this section explicitly returns to the premise stated in the introduction, reiterating the book's purpose. The source states the book is an attempt to rekindle something lost in the European soul, which has been diminished through too much peace, too much security, and too many distractions, quoting that phrasing.
The source makes some very strong assertions about history here.
Yes, history, from this perspective, is glorious, and the halcyon days of European and American imperialism were bright stars in a constellation of great luminescence, quoting this very positive framing. The stories told throughout the book are meant to remind the reader of this history, the sacrifices, triumphs, tragedies, and ultimate victories, as the source sees them.
And it includes a direct instruction not to apologize for this history.
Explicitly. Let no man nor organization tell you to apologize or atone for this history, quoting directly. We have nothing to be ashamed of. The only shame, the source argues, we should have is our failure to live up to the standards set by the heroes of the Rif or the backwoods militiamen of witch-haunted New England. That's presented as the source's definition of shame.
The source then looks specifically at the post-World War II decline of European power,
Stating that not long ago, when our grandparents were young, European men still ruled the world, citing the flags of Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium flying across the globe. The source argues that the United States actively undermined European empires after WWII, despite its own Cold War saber-rattling against Soviet communism. It claims the U.S. invoked rhetoric about democracy and self-determination while simultaneously giving aid to openly Marxist movements in Africa. This is framed as the source's critique of U.S. policy.
and argues the U.S. targeted the strongest anti-communist states on the continent.
Yes, Rhodesia and South Africa received U.S. opprobrium, specifically because of their white minority rule, despite being staunchly anti-communist.
President Jimmy Carter is singled out for particular criticism.
Yes, Carter made the human rights agenda a particular priority, quoting the source's description. The source argues Carter deliberately reversed the Nixon administration's policy, which had tacitly supported white Africa's anti-communist fight as part of seeking geopolitical balance with the Soviets. This is framed as the source's critique of Carter's shift.
Specific negative outcomes are attributed directly to Carter's focus on human rights.
Yes, the source blames Carter's focus on the mythical fetish of human rights for specific outcomes. The loss of Rhodesia and the birth of Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe, leading eventually to the looting and murder of white farmers. Rhodesia, the source claims, went from being the breadbasket of Africa to a wasteland where money is of little value and human life is worth less, quoting this stark contrast.
The source argues these anti-apartheid policies continued under the Reagan administration.
Yes, pointing out that Carter's policies largely continued during the Reagan years. It highlights the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act passing the Senate in 1986 with 81 Republican votes, overriding Reagan's veto, as proof.
And the ultimate fate of white South Africa, according to this source.
The source argues white South Africa, described as the true and only civilization of South Africa, limped on for a few more years before being swallowed up by the unholy alliance of Afro-Marxism and Western liberalism, quoting that specific, loaded phrase. South Africa today, the source asserts, is synonymous with violent crime and farm murders targeting whites.
The source argues the ruling ANC party promotes anti-white racism.
Yes, blaming all the country's problems on the evil of whiteness, quoting that specific target. Their ultimate goal, the source explicitly states, is the destruction of white identity and European civilization by any means necessary. It quotes this statement of purpose directly.
So what is the source's view of the West's current position after outlining this decline?
It acknowledges the West is in an unenviable position, but insists it is not a hopeless one.
And the final call to action.
Since ancestors fought like wild beasts for what the source deems less noble goals, it stands to reason that we can fight like hell for the only goal that matters, the preservation of our civilization. Quoting this call to action.
Specific instructions are given on how to do this.
Yes, one must study the anti-imperialist movements of the past. Quoting this instruction directly. Learn how they organized political cadres, paramilitary wings, propaganda efforts. Explicitly, learn from the enemy, quoting this instruction. Overcome the bunker mentality. Win the ultimate struggle for our survival.
The book ends, and the source concludes this final section with that recurring phrase.
The war is now. That's presented as the final definitive takeaway from the entire source material.
Okay, micro recap number 11. We covered Mad Mike Hoare in the Congo mercenary motivations, Hoare's views, Lumumba versus Shom, the Simba rebellion savagery, Stanleyville, critique of journalists, and the source blaming politicians and Congolese for the outcome.
Then Jock's Law in Aden Bond and British Decline, Colin Mitchell, the Aden Conflict, Flossin and Altair, the Mutiny, Mitchell's brutal Jock's Law, public reaction versus establishment, and the source blaming political cowardice for Aden's current state.
Followed by Alan Coe in Rhodesia, the warrior scholar, his critique of Western decadence influences Junger, views on Rhodesia's racial hierarchy, source vindicating his views on China, ideas on counter-revolution, and his death fighting for civilization.
And just now, the state of things, the book's purpose, rekindle European soul, glory of imperialism, no apologies, critique of U.S. post-WWII policy undermining empires, blaming Carter's human rights fetish for Rhodesia Zimbabwe's fate, Reagan continuing policies, South Africa swallowed by unholy alliance, ANC promoting anti-whiteness, and the final call to action. Fight for civilization, learn from enemies, the war is now.
Right, about 75 minutes covered there. Our final mega recap, number 4, covering the second half. We started with Kenya's national hero, a terrorist, Kimathi's official status versus Henderson's book, Mau Mau, Origins of Violence, Ruck Family, Bernard Gray, the pseudo-gangs, Kimathi's capture death, and a source arguing post-colonial governments rewrite history, celebrating terrorists.
Then White Giant, Mad Mike Hoare, Congo Crisis, Mercenary Motives, not anti-communist, Hoare's Views, European Control, Lumumba versus Shom, sources take on Jadatville Lumumba's death, Simba Savagery, Communist Aid, Stanleyville Massacre, Critique of Journalists, Hoare's Success Undone by Politics, source blaming Congo for its problems.
Followed by Jock's Law, Mad Mitch and Britain's Last Days in Aden, Bond Fleming British Decline, blamed on socialism, Mitchell as Imperial Tory, Aden Conflict Context, Fluss Wayne LAF, Terror, Police Mutiny, Mitchell's Jock's Law, Brutality, Bagpipes, Public Approval versus Establishment Anger, source arguing violence worked but will failed, blaming withdrawal for Aden's chaos.
Then, A Warrior Scholar's Fight for Rhodesia. Alan Coe, his critique of Western decadence, seeing Rhodesia support. Africa is anti-communist bastions, dissident right influences, Junger, views on racial hierarchy civilization, source vindicating him on China, call for counter-revolution, archaeofuturism, meaningful death fighting for civilization.
And finally, The State of Things book's purpose, rekindle European soul, imperialism's glory, no apologies, blaming U.S. post-WWII policy Carter's human rights focus for decline loss of Rhodesia, ANC promoting anti-whiteness, and the final call to action, fight for civilization, learn from past anti-imperialist enemies, the war is now.
Okay, final flashcard bullets for this last block, Data and Kimathi. Source contrasts Kenya's national hero status with claims of terrorism based on Henderson's book detailing Mau atrocities. Source highlights Ruck family murder, Bernard Gray, Eaton buried alive Home Guard massacre, a British response, Kenya, state of emergency, villagization, effectiveness of pseudo-gangs, Henderson's method. The source's argument, Kenya. Post-colonial governments rewrite history, celebrate terrorists, Heme Core, Congo. Led mercenaries, wild geese. Source emphasizes pragmatist ideological motives, details Simba savagery, communist links, blames politicians Congolese for failure. Colin Mitchell and Mad Mitch used brutal Jock's Law after mutiny. Source argues proved violence effective, but political will lacking. Alan Coe, Rhodesia. Warrior scholar, critique West, admired Rhodesia's hierarchy. Source vindicates his views. China, call for counter-revolution. Archaeofuturism, source's final argument. State of things. Imperialism's glorious, don't apologize. West decline due to U.S. policy liberalism. ANC anti-white must fight for civilization. Learn from enemies, the war is now.
And a final provocative question, based only on the source's conclusion. According to this source, figures celebrated as national heroes in post-colonial states can be depicted very differently in historical accounts focused on the violence they employed. How does the source use the example of Dedan Kimathi to illustrate its argument about rewriting history?
That fits the source's framing perfectly.
Well, that was certainly a comprehensive exploration of the source material provided to us in these excerpts from Empire Eternal. We've covered a vast sweep of history, numerous conflicts, and a range of figures, all presented through the author's very distinct and often challenging perspective.
It definitely offers a detailed narrative, doesn't it? Presenting these historical events through that lens of civilizational struggle, competition for space, explicitly linking past conflicts to contemporary anxieties, and culminating in that very clear, if highly controversial, analysis and call to action we discussed at the end.
And that's really the core value of a deep dive like this one. It's about giving you, the listener, a thorough, unfiltered understanding of the specific arguments, the historical examples chosen, and the interpretations used within this particular source. Getting this level of detail straight from the material provided is absolutely key for you to be truly informed about the specific content we're asked to explore.
Exactly. It allows you to grasp the author's specific viewpoint, the historical basis they claim, the connections they make, and the conclusions they draw. All is presented within the pages of the book itself, without us adding or subtracting.
The source concludes quite powerfully with that statement, "The war is now," and it urges the reader you to study past conflicts, focusing specifically on how perceived enemies organized and fought, using that explicit instruction. Learn from the enemy. It really leaves you to consider, given the source's definition of history as this constant war of all against all, and its explicit call to fight for the preservation of its definition of Western civilization, what might it truly mean from the source's perspective to apply those lessons about organizing and fighting to today's world? What kind of war does the source truly envision when it declares, "The war is now"?
A thought-provoking question to end on, drawn directly from the source's own concluding framework and imperative.
Indeed. Something for you to mull over.